The story of the Vanderlinde Gang is an American tragedy on horseback, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a family that tried to outrun history and became its cautionary tale. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s to its shattered remnants in the mechanized early 1900s, this gang rode straight through the fault line where freedom met civilization, and where the old ways were dying under steel, smoke, and law. In the truest sense, the Vanderlinde Gang is the living embodiment of a changing world. Their rise and fall stretches from dusty frontier towns and hand-painted, wanted posters to cities lit by electric bulbs and patrolled by Pinkertons with telegraphs at their backs. The world was changing, and every ride, every robbery, every campfire argument becomes part of a single, long collision between outlaw philosophy and the cold machinery of money, government, and progress. At the center of this story stands Dutch van der Linde, an idealistic outlaw preacher whose words promise freedom, equality, and a war against a rigged system. Around him gather lost souls and hopeful believers: Hosea the weary conman, Arthur the loyal enforcer, John the restless prodigal, and a camp full of misfits who mistake Dutch's rhetoric for salvation. Their camp is both refuge and pressure cooker, a place where coffee, chores, and quiet conversations sit beside gun oil, blood, and whispered doubts. This gang is a microcosm of America itself, torn between idealism and greed, between community and individual survival. Dutch speaks of liberty while chasing bigger scores. He denounces civilization's cruelty while depending on its banks and railroads as targets. His dream of a self-sufficient family in the wilderness slowly twists into paranoia and self-preservation, turning promises of one more job into a death sentence for those who still believe. Across this video, 200 interlocking facts will be woven into one continuous saga. Hidden camp conversations, throwaway lines about the Blackwater Ferry, lawmen's gossip, secret documents, and quiet graves on forgotten hillsides will be stitched together into a single chronological story. From the very beginning, when two conmen meet and accidentally try to rob each other, to the last desperate stands in Beaver Hollow and beyond. This is their complete lore, told as one unbroken history rather than scattered memories. Along the way, certain contrasts will define everything. Dutch's dream versus the brutal reality closing in around him. Arthur's faith in the gang versus the doubts carved into him by loss and disease. John's pull between pragmatic survival and a lingering nostalgia for the only family he ever knew. Again and again, freedom on horseback will crash against the iron rails, counting houses and courthouses of a civilization that has already decided their fate. This is the Vanderlinde saga, from first spark to final ember. The story begins not with a gunshot, but with an idea. That idea is what this video will follow, from its humble beginnings to its final collapse. This is their complete story, from Dutch and Hosea's first awkward meeting in the 1870s to the last desperate bullets at Beaver Hollow and the quiet, haunted aftermath that bleeds straight into Blackwater, New Austin, and the events of Red Dead Redemption. Across 200 carefully chosen facts, the Vanderlinde Gang will be rebuilt in the truest sense, not as a disconnected trivia list, but as a single, continuous narrative, where every stray line of camp dialogue, every newspaper clipping, every stranger mission and in-game document fits into one long timeline, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family built on an idealistic philosophy and torn apart by the slow advance of civilization. The format is simple, but the effect is not. Each chapter in the gang's life will be anchored by a stretch of time or a camp, Coulter's frozen exile, the uneasy comfort of Horseshoe Overlook, the decaying grandeur of Shady Bell, the rot of Beaver Hollow, and inside each, a rapid flow of facts will reveal how these outlaws really lived. One moment, a passing remark from Javier about an early robbery. The next, a ledger entry that quietly proves who was really funding Dutch's grand plans. The starting point will not be Arthur Morgan or John Marston riding into frame already broken and world-weary. It begins earlier, with two young con men circling the same mark in a small town, each planning to rob him, each realizing, almost too late, that the other is trying to do the same. Dutch Vanderlinde and Hosea Matthews meet as rivals, but leave as partners, accidentally founding not just a gang, but a philosophy about freedom, family, and resistance to a world that was changing. From that moment, the story will move forward without flinching. It will track the adoption of Arthur as a teenager, the arrival of John, the early years when Dutch's code still meant something, and the slow shift as the old ways were dying and the gang's noble rhetoric masked harsher truths. Every key heist, every feud with Colm O'Driscoll, every campfire argument will be grounded in specific, often missed details. The endpoint is clear. Beaver Hollow, Arthur's last ride through a world he finally sees for what it is. John's escape into a future already claimed by railroads and government agents. The dream dies there, but its echo carries into Blackwater and beyond, turning Red Dead Redemption into not just a sequel, but an epilogue to this saga. Along the way, lesser-known members, cut content, and barely heard lines will step into the light. What did Uncle really do before all this? Why does Bill overreact to every slight? How did Micah, a late arrival, become the living embodiment of Dutch's worst impulses? These 200 facts will not just fill gaps, they will reframe familiar missions, expose the gang's internal politics, and show how every lost soul in that camp helped write the ending long before Beaver Hollow. And when the last fact lands, the entire Vanderlinde timeline, from the very beginning to the final reckoning, will stand exposed as one continuous, tragic arc. From that promise of a complete tragic arc, the story cuts back to the very beginning, to a chance encounter on a train in the 1870s that would change the West. Not with a massacre, not with a grand robbery, with two men trying to run the same con at the same time. The Mark was wealthy, smug, and certain the world existed to serve him. Dutch Vanderlinde approached first, dressed better than most outlaws, speaking with an ease that felt more professor than bandit. He quoted books the man had actually read, talked about civilization choking freedom, and eased the conversation toward investments. Opportunities, discreet transfers of money, a story of progress and profit, tailored to a man who believed both were his birthright. A few seats away, Hosea Matthews watched. Older, quieter, taking in every detail, the man's jewelry, his nervous tics, the way he glanced at the conductor. Hosea had already picked his angle, a different scam about forged bonds and a fake business deal. As the train rattled on, he rose to make his move, only to realize Dutch was already mid-performance, spinning his own web around the exact same victim. What followed was not a shootout, but a duel of smiles. Dutch turned, clocked Hosea instantly, and in a heartbeat understood. Another predator, another outlaw with a taste for theater. Hosea, just as quick, saw through Dutch's charm to the calculation beneath. Each man knew the other was running a scam, and for a few taut seconds, the air between them felt ready to explode. Two cons, one mark, one narrow aisle. Who would blink first? Then the tension broke, not with gunfire, but with laughter. Dutch leaned into Hosea's story, improvising details that made the fake deal sound even more convincing. Hosea picked up Dutch's invented names and dates without missing a beat. The wealthy man never stood a chance. By the time the train slowed, his pockets were lighter, his pride intact, and his memory already rewriting events to protect his ego. The origin of the Vanderlinde Gang was, from its humble beginnings, a partnership in deception rather than destruction. That moment revealed Dutch in the truest sense. Charismatic, educated, theatrical, he was the living embodiment of an idealistic outlaw philosophy: rob the rich, spare the poor, fight a rigged system with wit and guns. He spoke of freedom and family, of dreams of a world where the old ways were dying but could be reclaimed at gunpoint. He believed it, or at least needed to. Hosea believed in survival. Observant, pragmatic, older, and more grounded, he saw Dutch's romanticism as both strength and danger. He admired the fire, questioned the delusions, and quickly became the quiet moral anchor who asked what each scheme would cost in blood and conscience. Together they balanced each other, dreamer and realist, preacher and skeptic, philosophy and practical theft. The choice they made on that train, neither to kill each other nor compete, but to walk off together, splitting the take and planning the next job, echoed through every life the gang later touched. It was the first great decision of their shared story. But what happens when a partnership built on deception starts believing its own legend? From that first shared train job, the partnership between Dutch Vanderlinde and Hosea Matthews settled into a pattern that would define an era. Two men, one dream, and a growing talent for convincing themselves they were better than the outlaws around them. From its humble beginnings, it was already a story of freedom and philosophy, of crime wrapped in a conscience. Their early work was small, sharp, and strangely elegant. Dutch and Hosea drifted through a world where the old ways were dying, picking targets that fit their self-made legend, wealthy ranchers who underpaid their hands, smug railroad men, corrupt officials skimming from public coffers. Rather than charge in with guns drawn, they preferred elaborate cons. Hosea posing as a timid accountant, Dutch as a charming investor, Hosea as a doctor, Dutch as a desperate husband. Each routine rehearsed, each escape route mapped. If a robbery could be done with a handshake, a forged signature, and a disappearing strongbox, that was, in the truest sense, a perfect score. Out of these jobs, Dutch's first version of the code took shape. No senseless killing. Protect women and children. Only rob those who could afford it. Share the spoils with anyone who rode beside them. Around campfires and cheap hotel rooms, Dutch turned those rules into speeches, insisting they were not common thieves, but a living embodiment of resistance to a rigged civilization. Hosea would roll his eyes, but he never walked away. The money was good, and the dream was better. Hosea's influence kept that dream grounded. Where Dutch reached for spectacle, Hosea argued for subtlety. He preferred quiet scores over flashy violence, a clean getaway over a famous one. When Dutch spoke of blowing a safe on a ferry or staging a robbery in broad daylight, Hosea reminded him that survival beat speeches, that dead men could not change the world. Their early run-ins with lawmen, hinted at in Dutch's later stories about escaping posses and outwitting sheriffs, usually ended with Hosea dragging Dutch out before pride turned to bloodshed. Yet the cracks were there from the very beginning. When a mark was richer than expected, Dutch's principles bent. A promise to leave a frightened clerk unharmed might become a pistol whipped into silence. A vow not to hit a certain town again might vanish when Hosea laid out the numbers and admitted, quietly, that the risk was worth it. They robbed a ferry once and got away clean, a rehearsal for the Blackwater disaster that would haunt them decades later. Each time Dutch justified the danger, each time Hosea went along, the gap between their ideals and their actions widened. Those pre-gang years, scattered through offhand camp dialogue and half-boasted stories, were a long rehearsal for the family they would build. The code, the rhetoric, the careful targets, and the little betrayals of their own philosophy. The question was never whether the dream would grow. It was how long it could hold before that first compromise demanded a far higher price. That compromise arrived slowly, almost politely, in the form of new faces around the fire. From its humble beginnings as two men working angles across the frontier, Dutch and Hosea's partnership began to draw in drifters, runaways, and the occasional desperate family with nowhere else to go. What started as a duo became a camp, and then, before either man fully admitted it, a community. At first, the additions were practical. A good shot here, a reliable rider there, a woman who could cook and patch wounds, a boy who could keep lookout. But each new arrival came with a story of their own, a ranch hand cheated by a railroad company, a widow pushed off her land by debt, a lost soul who had already been thrown away by respectable civilization. Dutch saw them as proof that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that his philosophy was needed more than ever. His language shifted. The same man who once boasted about clever scores now spoke in sweeping declarations about freedom and fate. Banks, railroads, and the government ceased to be mere obstacles and became enemies in the truest sense. Faceless machines grinding down ordinary people. Robbing a train was no longer just a payday. It was framed as striking back against a rigged system. Was it justice, or a story of self-justification told around the campfire until everyone believed it? Hosea listened to that rhetoric with a quiet, almost fond skepticism. He understood that money meant safety, that a well-run gang could give them a chance to retire somewhere quiet, with full pockets and no regrets. For him, the camp was a means to an end, not the living embodiment of some grand revolution. Yet he rarely challenged Dutch outright. Why puncture a dream that kept frightened men loyal and gave orphan boys something to believe in? Together, without planning it, they built a utopian experiment on wagon wheels. Tents were shared, resources pooled, and spoils divided in a way that made even the newest recruit feel included. Around the fire, there was music, stories, and a sense of belonging that many had never known. In that circle, an outlaw could be a father, a widow could be protected. A misfit could finally call something home. For a time, it felt less like a criminal outfit and more like a family. Morally, they drew lines, flexible, but lines all the same. The powerful and corrupt were fair game. The poor were often left alone or even quietly helped after a job. A rancher who beat his workers might wake up penniless. A banker who foreclosed on too many farms might find his vault mysteriously light. Was this true honor, or just selective mercy that made them feel like heroes in their own story? In that tension, between Dutch's grand ideals and Hosea's grounded pragmatism, the Vanderlinde Gang took shape, a philosophy wrapped in campfire warmth. The dream was working. For now. But even as the dream seemed to hold, cracks were already forming in the creed that held it together. From its humble beginnings, the gang carried a contradiction at its core, a leader who preached restraint and justice, and an outlaw who craved spectacle. Dutch spoke often about freedom and dignity, about striking only at those who deserved it. Around the campfire, he would say, "We're not common thieves. We're agents of change." Yet the missions tell a quieter truth. He insisted on grand gestures, on robberies that made a statement rather than simply filled the coffers. A small-town bank could be taken quietly, but Dutch preferred a front-door assault, guns drawn, shouting his philosophy to terrified clerks. Was this about helping the poor, or proving to the world that Dutch van der Linde mattered? Arthur's journal catches that tension from the very beginning. He writes about Dutch wanting big scores when smaller hauls would do, and notes that Dutch likes the show of it, as if the performance is half the reward. Dutch rails against civilization, against the cages of the modern world. Yet he keeps placing his family in the most visible cages of all: Main Street, broad daylight, everyone watching. Standing beside him, Hosea quietly tries to pull the reins. When Dutch pushes for a risky target, Hosea asks the simple questions. Who gets hurt? What does this prove? In planning stages, he argues for stagecoaches over banks, for swindles over shootouts, for exits over last stands. He warns against escalating violence with the O'Driscolls, reminding Dutch that vengeance is not a philosophy, just a habit with better vocabulary. In private, Hosea is even more honest. He admits to Arthur that Dutch can't always live up to his own words, and there is no malice in it, only weary affection. Hosea understands that Dutch is the living embodiment of his own speeches, and that the man cannot bear to be seen as anything less. So when Dutch bends the code to justify a dangerous robbery or a needless risk, Hosea recognizes what is really being protected, not the gang, but Dutch's image as savior. Because Dutch does not just need followers, he needs believers. His identity is bound to the role of leader, teacher, prophet of the dying West. When a new recruit arrives, Bill, Javier, a lost soul looking for purpose, they are drawn less to the promise of money and more to the promise of meaning. Dutch offers them a story of family and resistance, of loyalty and rebellion against a rigged civilization. In the truest sense, his speeches are currency. Every rousing monologue buys one more day of faith. The tragedy is that this gift will curdle. The same charisma that builds a family will one day be used to hold it together through lies, paranoia, and blood. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch van der Linde would rather twist his creed than admit he was wrong. The question is how many people he would drag with him before the illusion finally shattered. But before Dutch can drag anyone into the abyss, someone has to step into his light. That someone is Arthur Morgan. And from the very beginning, his life is a story of a boy born with no future and handed one by outlaws. Arthur enters the world already on the wrong side of civilization. His father, Lyle Morgan, is a petty criminal, drifting through the collapsing edges of the American frontier, in and out of jail, in and out of responsibility. There is no stable home, no real schooling, only smoke-filled rooms, back alleys, and the constant lesson that the world is hard and mercy is rare. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and a poor boy without land, name, or trade had little chance of honest freedom. From its humble beginnings, Arthur's childhood is marked by absence. His mother dies when he is still young. His father is more rumor than presence, a man Arthur later calls a useless bastard in his journal. That journal, scratched out in rough handwriting years later, remembers hunger, cold nights, and the quiet understanding that no one is coming to save him. In the truest sense, he grows up already halfway outside the law, not because of grand philosophy, but because there is nowhere else to stand. The pivotal moment comes when Arthur is barely a teenager. Caught stealing from a man's house, he is dragged before the law, another nameless delinquent in a country that has decided what to do with such boys, prison, the noose, or a life ground down in chain gangs. There is no advocate, no family, no preacher pleading for his soul, just a frightened kid who has never seen any world beyond survival, suddenly staring down the machinery of order. Arthur's early cynicism grows from this. In his later reflections, he writes that people talk about doing good, then hang a boy for stealing a loaf. His jokes at camp often carry that same bitter edge, mocking civilization's rules while quietly revealing how deeply he has been failed by them. Lonely, suspicious, yet desperate for some structure, he is the perfect target for anyone who can offer meaning, rules, and a name for his anger. Who else would he trust but the first adults who seem to see more than a criminal record? Here the pattern breaks. Instead of disappearing into a cell, Arthur meets Dutch and Hosea. Two conmen walk into a jail to recruit a thief rather than rob him, and the trajectory of an entire gang changes. They see not just a strong back, but a lost soul who can be shaped into the living embodiment of their ideals about freedom, family, and resistance. Arthur's rough upbringing makes him uniquely suited to this life. He knows how to steal, how to go hungry, how to keep moving. Yet it also plants the seeds of doubt that will one day define him. Having seen the cost of crime from the bottom up, he is both the gang's fiercest defender and the one man capable of truly questioning what it all means. When Dutch and Hosea take him under their wing, they are not just recruiting muscle, they are rewriting a destiny that was headed toward oblivion. Dutch teaches him to read, to speak, to dress his rage in philosophy. Hosea teaches him to hunt, to listen, to see the world as it really is rather than as Dutch insists it could be. Between them, they turn a scared boy in chains into the gang's emotional anchor, the man who will one day hold everyone together even as the dream falls apart. The next step is to see how that makes Arthur not just a follower of Dutch's creed, but its first true test. Arthur's recruitment is where Dutch's philosophy stops being just talk and becomes flesh and blood. From its humble beginnings as two drifting conmen, the gang finally gains something more than partners in crime, an heir. The moment itself is almost darkly comic. A teenage Arthur Morgan, already the son of a petty criminal and already on the wrong side of civilization, is caught in the act of stealing from the wrong men. He tries to rob Dutch and Hosea, not knowing they are seasoned outlaws who have been running their own game for years. Two thieves, each thinking they have the upper hand, standing in a frozen moment that will define an entire future. They could have shot him. They could have turned him in. Instead, they see themselves. Dutch looks at Arthur and recognizes potential, raw and angry. Hosea looks and recognizes a lost soul with nowhere to go. In that instant, the choice to recruit rather than punish becomes the first true test of Dutch's creed, that the world is cruel, that the old ways were dying, and that men like them must build their own freedom on the margins. Taking Arthur in is an act of mercy, of practicality, and of ego all at once. From there, a dual mentorship takes shape. Dutch becomes the voice in Arthur's ear, filling his head with ideals about loyalty, about standing up to a rigged system, about making their crimes into a story of resistance rather than simple greed. He teaches Arthur to read, to quote books, to believe that the gang is more than an outlaw band. It is, in the truest sense, a philosophy with guns. Hosea balances that with quiet realism. He shows Arthur how to hunt, how to track, how to pick marks without getting caught. Where Dutch tells him what the world should be, Hosea shows him how the world actually is. One gives Arthur dreams, the other gives him tools. Together, they turn him into the living embodiment of their partnership. In Dutch's mind, Arthur quickly becomes more than a proc. He is a surrogate son, the greatest success story Dutch can point to when justifying everything. Look at Arthur, a boy headed for the noose. Now a man with purpose, with family, with a code. If Dutch can save Arthur, can he not save others? Is the gang not proof that his vision works? Arthur believes. For years, he is the most consistent enforcer of that code, insisting they are different from common criminals, that they help the weak and punish the powerful, even when reality blurs those lines. As long as Arthur believes, Dutch's reflection in his eyes stays heroic. That is the quiet validation loop forming beneath the surface. Dutch needs Arthur's faith to believe in himself. The day that faith begins to crack, the gang's center of gravity will shift, and the story of family will start to sound more and more like a story of betrayal. The next phase of the gang's journey will show how adding more children to this fragile family only deepens that tension. As the gang grows around Dutch, Arthur becomes more than a survivor clinging to a cause. He becomes the mechanism that makes Dutch's philosophy real. The speeches belong to Dutch, but the consequences belong to Arthur. From its humble beginnings, this strange outlaw family needs someone to turn big ideas into full saddlebags. So Arthur grows into Dutch's right hand in the truest sense, planning routes, leading robberies, and riding at the front when bullets start to fly. Dutch talks about striking back at civilization. Arthur is the one kicking in the doors at Valentine's Bank, hauling Leviticus Cornwall's bonds out of his train, and enforcing discipline when tempers boil over in camp. When someone has to rough up Strauss's debtors, threaten a witness, or finish a job Dutch no longer wants to look at too closely, it is almost always Arthur who rides out. Dutch becomes the living embodiment of the dream. Arthur becomes the cost. Yet inside the camp, the same man who breaks jaws for the gang quietly becomes its protector. In the morning, he helps Abigail find Jack, tells the boy stories, carves him toys, and takes him fishing to show him a gentler world than the one waiting outside the trees. He hauls firewood, fixes wagons, and checks on the women Dutch claims to shelter. Stepping in when Bill gets drunk or Uncle gets lazy. He slips money to Mary Beth, comforts Tilly after threats from her past, and backs up Sadie when others doubt her place. For the weaker members, Arthur is the one who actually makes Dutch's talk of family feel real, even as the world was changing around them. At this stage, his certainty is almost unshakable. In his journal, he defends Dutch's choices, dismisses the idea of settling down as cowardice, and mocks the notion of living under the law's thumb. The law to Arthur is inherently corrupt, a tool of railroads and bankers, not justice. When Hosea muses about buying a little place and growing old, Arthur scoffs, insisting their freedom lies on the move, with guns loaded and enemies behind them. To question Dutch is to question the only story that ever gave his life meaning. But even from the very beginning of 1899, hairline fractures appear. Arthur bristles when Dutch leaves the wounded behind at Coulter, hesitates when Micah pushes for needless cruelty in Strawberry, and grows uneasy as innocent townsfolk get pulled into the gang's spiraling violence. A debtor's sick family lingers in his mind. The sight of Jack, frightened by gunfire, cuts deeper than any bullet. He still rides for Dutch, still pulls the trigger, but the journal that once echoed pure belief begins to record unease. This journey, from true believer to questioning skeptic to self-sacrificing protector, will become the emotional spine of the gang's rise and fall. When the next disasters hit, who will Arthur save, Dutch's dream, or the people trapped inside it? And what happens to a family when its enforcer quietly becomes its conscience? Arthur's doubts are only half the story of this family's unraveling. To understand how the dream breaks, another lost soul has to step into the light. John Marston, the boy who never really believed in dreams to begin with. From the very beginning, John's life is a story of absence and punishment. His father, a Scottish immigrant and petty criminal, died when John was still young. His mother followed soon after, leaving him alone in a world that did not forgive weakness. Shuffled through orphanages and makeshift homes, John remembers starvation as a constant companion and beatings as routine discipline. This was not a childhood of mischief and adventure. It was survival, day after day. Hunger pushed him into petty crime. He stole to eat, slept in alleys and barns, and learned quickly that promises meant nothing when a man was desperate enough. In a bitter echo of Arthur's past, John was caught trying to rob someone in his early teens. But where Arthur had been the son of a drunk outlaw, John was truly rootless, with no family name that carried even a hint of protection. He was, in the truest sense, expendable. Then Dutch found him. Or, perhaps more accurately, Dutch recognized him. The pattern repeats with almost eerie precision. A half-starved teenager with quick hands, a chip on his shoulder, and nowhere to go. Dutch looked at John and saw another lost soul to save, another chance to prove that his philosophy could redeem the broken. Hosea saw the same. They offered food, shelter, and something even more dangerous than a full belly, belonging. But John was not Arthur. Where Arthur craved structure, John had been taught by the world that structure usually meant someone standing over him with a belt or a stick. Where Arthur quickly embraced Dutch's rhetoric about freedom and civilization, John listened with narrowed eyes. slower to accept that any man preaching so loudly about loyalty would not eventually turn on him. Could any family be trusted when the last ones had sold him off or beaten him bloody? The game's quietest lore hints make this psychology clear. John's throwaway comments about nearly starving to death, about the beatings and worse in those institutions, explain his later obsession with putting food on the table for Abigail and Jack. His dream is not grand revolution. It is a roof that does not leak, a job that does not end at the barrel of a gun, a future where his son never has to learn which trash heap has the best scraps. That is what makes John both the living embodiment of Dutch's success and the seed of his undoing. Dutch gives him a life, a purpose, even a warped sense of honor, but John never entirely stops questioning the cost. He will ride for the gang, kill for the gang, and nearly die for the gang. Yet a part of him is always measuring Dutch's promises against the cold memory of those orphanage walls. As the world was changing and the old ways were dying, John stood at a crossroads Arthur never quite reached, remain the loyal enforcer of an outlaw philosophy, or become its harshest critic from within. The next time John disappears, and the gang mutters about betrayal, whose abandonment is really on trial, John's or Dutch's? That crossroads does not exist in a vacuum. It is carved out, day after day, by the tension between Dutch's two surrogate sons, Arthur Morgan and John Marston. Their relationship is a story of loyalty and rivalry, of shared bloodshed and quiet resentment, and from its humble beginnings it becomes the living embodiment of the gang's rise and fall. Arthur is the established lieutenant, the man Dutch raised from the very beginning into an outlaw who does not just follow the philosophy, but breathes it. Around camp he moves with an earned authority, collecting debts for Strauss, calming Bill's tantrums, backing Dutch in front of doubtful eyes. John, by contrast, drifts in as the scrappier, less polished prodigal, the boy who ran off for a year and came limping back from wolves and O'Driscolls with scars and a family he can barely support. Arthur has internalized Dutch's rhetoric about freedom and civilization so deeply that questioning Dutch feels, at first, like questioning family itself. John respects Dutch, even loves him, yet keeps a sliver of emotional distance, as if some part of him never quite forgets the orphanage walls and the years of abandonment. Arthur is the loyal believer. John is the wary beneficiary. That difference turns into friction almost immediately. Around the horseshoe overlook campfire, Arthur mocks John for disappearing, calling him unreliable, while John snaps back that Arthur is Dutch's golden boy. Their barbed comments about who does the real work and who Dutch trusts more are not just jokes. They are open contests for a father's approval. When they ride into Valentine together, Arthur grumbles that John will get them killed, and John mutters that Arthur is too busy defending Dutch's honor to see the danger ahead. Mission by mission, their clash of belief becomes clear. In early robberies, Arthur reassures everyone that Dutch has a plan, that one more score will set them free. John, standing on the same muddy streets and bloodied rooftops, occasionally wonders aloud how long they can keep running, or whether Blackwater proved the dreams were already delusions. When Dutch proposes rescuing Sean or robbing Cornwall, Arthur instinctively backs him. John weighs the odds and, more than once, suggests that the world was changing faster than Dutch admits. Who is right, the faithful lieutenant or the reluctant prophet? Yet beneath the tension lies genuine brotherhood. Arthur hauls John out of the snow at Coulter, then later charges through gunfire at Fort Mercer and in the St. Denis chaos to cover John's escape. John, in turn, rides into danger for Arthur in small, telling moments, backing him in skirmishes, trusting his word over Micah's, sharing rare, rough-edged jokes about aging outlaws and stubborn old men. In the truest sense, they become the only witnesses to each other's doubts. As the old ways were dying and Dutch's mask began to slip, their bond slowly shifts from rivalry to mutual respect. That evolution, from cutting insults to quiet understanding to a final, heartbreaking parting on the ridge above Beaver Hollow, will mirror the gang's own journey from unity to fragmentation, from family to betrayal. When the time comes to choose between Dutch's fading legend and John's fragile future, Arthur's decision will not just end one man's story, it will decide which brother walks back toward civilization and which rides out into myth. Arthur's choice on that ridge will draw a line through the gang, but that line had been forming for years. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde family carried within it a quiet argument, faith versus doubt, sermon versus side-eye. Dutch had Arthur as his devoted disciple. He had Hosea as his partner in philosophy. What he never truly had was John. Even in the early camps, long before St. Denis and Beaver Hollow, John Marston was the one who looked past the campfire speeches and asked the question no preacher wants to hear, and then what? When Dutch promised that one last score would buy their freedom, John would glance at his scarred hands and mutter, "How many last scores is that now?" It was not open rebellion. It was a slow, needling skepticism that refused to disappear. John's doubts always circled the same fears. He worried about age, about the body that could not outrun Pinkertons forever, about a world where civilization was closing in and the old ways were dying. Around the fire, he would half joke, "One day I'm going to have to quit this outlaw nonsense, get a little ranch. Teach some kid not to be me." On the surface, it was a throwaway line. In the truest sense, it was a confession. He was already imagining a life beyond Dutch's dreams and delusions. That instinct sharpened once Abigail and Jack entered the story. John might disappear for weeks, but when he returned, his questions cut deeper. How many times we going to drag a kid from camp to camp, Dutch? How long before a stray bullet finds him instead of us? Dutch would answer with grand speeches about protecting family, about striking back at a rigged world. John would listen, nod, and then quietly say, "Yeah, sure," until the next town runs us out again. This was where the fracture truly began. Dutch needed gratitude from those he saved. He needed to be the living embodiment of their salvation, the man who turned lost soul into loyal soldier. Arthur gave him that, at least for many years. John did not. His loyalty was real in action, he rode on jobs, bled for the gang, but he never surrendered his judgment. He mocked the sermons even as he followed the orders. Arthur, watching this, sided with Dutch. To Arthur, John's reluctance looked like weakness, even betrayal. He grumbled that John wanted the rewards of the life without the responsibility, that Abigail had softened him, that a real man did not question the hand that fed him. When Dutch raged that John was ungrateful, Arthur often agreed. Believer and skeptic were now sharing the same fire, but hearing two different stories. Yet as the law tightened its noose, John's questions began to sound less like cowardice and more like prophecy. What happens when the last score fails? What happens when there is no new frontier to run to? Only railroads and telegraphs and Pinkertons. When that moment comes, whose instincts will lead toward survival and whose toward the cliff? The answer will shatter the gang, and Dutch's need to be worshipped will finally meet a man who refuses to kneel. Dutch's hunger to be followed meets its perfect fuel in the years that come next. Success, every job that goes right, every train that gets stopped, and every coach that disappears into the trees turns the Vanderlinde Gang from rumor into destination. From its humble beginnings as 3 men and a boy, the gang becomes a moving beacon for the desperate. Word spreads along cattle trails and saloon counters. There is a band of outlaws who rob the rich, who share their spoils, who talk about freedom as if it is still possible. Drifters hear it. Ex-soldiers hear it. Families whose farms have been swallowed by banks and railroads hear it. And some of them go looking for Dutch in the truest sense, hunting not just a leader, but a place to belong. What they find is a story of need meeting opportunity. Each new recruit arrives with a wound and a reason. One man comes with scars from a war, fought for a country that forgot him. Another comes with a wife and child he cannot feed, convinced that Dutch's campfire speeches are the last defense against a civilization that has already written him off. A girl runs from a town that branded her ruined. A boy runs from a father who beat the dream out of him. Dutch calls them family, and the word works like a key turning in a locked heart. Bill Williamson is among the first of these new faces. A former soldier, dishonorably discharged, he carries his failure like a weight he cannot set down. His temper is quick, his pride brittle, his insecurity bottomless. Dutch sees that fragility and dresses it in purpose, telling Bill that he is a necessary hammer in a corrupt world. Javier Escuela follows from another direction, a revolutionary from Mexico whose fight against tyranny has been twisted by defeat and exile. To Javier, Dutch's philosophy of resistance feels familiar, almost holy, even if the methods have shifted from manifestos to masked robberies. Here the pattern interrupt arrives. The gang stops being just a gang. Camp becomes a roaming town. Tents turn into neighborhoods with an informal main street around the stew pot and the hitching posts. roles emerge without ever being formally declared. Some hunt, some cook, some watch the children, some sharpen guns and grudges. Morning routines, evening songs, shared chores. This is the living embodiment of Dutch's claim that an outlaw band can be more honest than the society chasing it. With every new arrival, Dutch's self-image swells. Each lost soul he saves becomes another argument that his dreams are not delusions, that the old ways were dying but he alone found a way to keep freedom alive. Yet every extra mouth also demands a bigger score, a riskier plan, a louder sermon. How long can that balance hold before the need to feed the family turns the family into bait? That balance survives only because some men are willing to hold it up on their backs. For Dutch, muscle is never just muscle. It is a story of wounded pride, redirected anger, and borrowed purpose. Few embody that better than Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela. Bill's tale begins in uniform, not in a duster. From its humble beginnings, his life is marked by failure. He serves in the U.S. Army, but not with honor. Dialogue in camp and John's bitter remarks in the first Red Dead Redemption reveal the truth. Bill is discharged in disgrace, mocked by comrades, remembered not as a hero but as a drunk, a coward, a man who could not live up to the standards of a civilization he barely understood. The world was changing, and Bill was not changing with it. When Bill talks around the fire in RDR2, the insecurity leaks through the bravado. He complains that people laugh at him, that they never take him seriously. In one conversation, he fumes that the others think he is just an idiot with a gun. That is the old army wound reopening. Dutch sees it, and Dutch knows how to talk to wounds. He calls Bill a soldier, praises his discipline, frames the gang as a unit, a cause, a place where Bill's obedience and violence finally mean something. For a man haunted by failure, that recognition is intoxicating. If Bill is the failed soldier, Javier is the failed revolutionary. From the very beginning of his introductions, Javier speaks of Mexico, of fighting corruption and tyranny, of siding with the poor against cruel landowners. In camp conversations, he recalls being hunted, betrayed, forced to flee north. He is not just a gunman, he is the living embodiment of a dream that collapsed under the weight of reality. Dutch hears revolution and translates it into his own philosophy. To Javier, Dutch becomes another insurgent leader, standing against railroads, bankers, and the law. When Dutch tells him that the gang fights for freedom, against a rigged world where the old ways were dying, Javier believes him in the truest sense. The robberies become expropriations, the murders become necessary. The camp becomes a guerrilla camp in exile rather than a bandit hideout. Both men find what they lacked. Bill finds family that salutes him instead of spitting on him. Javier finds a new cause when the old one is ashes. Dutch tailors his rhetoric carefully. To Bill he promises order and belonging. To Javier he promises ideals and justice. Is it any wonder their loyalty hardens into something dangerous? Because when Dutch begins to slide, they cannot admit it. Bill clings to the only commander who ever saluted him. Javier clings to the only banner left to raise. Long after Arthur starts to question, long after John starts to pull away, Bill and Javier remain, the last true believers, propping up a dream that has already rotted into delusions. And that loyalty will not just keep them in Dutch's orbit. It will turn them into enemies when the family finally tears itself apart. That blind loyalty has a mirror image in camp, and it is not carrying a rifle. It is stirring a pot, hanging laundry, reading a dog-eared book to a child while gunshots echo faintly in the distance. If Bill and Javier are the last true believers on the firing line, the women and children are the living embodiment of what Dutch claims to be fighting for. From the very beginning of 1899, the gang presents itself as a family, and its women bear the proof of that story. Abigail Roberts comes from brothels and back rooms, passed between outlaws and drifters before Dutch's gang gives her something resembling stability. Karen Jones is a con artist who has survived on charm and liquor, a lost soul laughing a little too loudly at the campfire. Tilly Jackson is a black woman who escaped another gang that treated her as property. Mary Beth Gaskill is a shy pickpocket who reads dime novels about romance while living in a world built on robbery. Each of them arrives from abuse, poverty, or marginalization, so the camp feels, in the truest sense, like refuge. Abigail's arc makes that illusion clearest. Once a prostitute working out of the Smithfield saloon, She has seen what happens to women without protection in this world. With John and then Jack, her dreams shrink from adventure to something deceptively simple. A roof, a school, a life where her son does not grow up an outlaw. Dutch promises that future over and over. One last score. One last train. One last bank. Freedom in some distant land where civilization cannot reach them. Abigail knows the life is unsustainable, but Dutch's philosophy and Arthur's presence keep her tethered, half believing that this man who quotes Shakespeare and rails against the rich will eventually make good on his word. Day to day, the camp conspires to make that belief feel real. At Horseshoe Overlook in Clemens Point, the women cook stews, mend clothes, and gossip over washtubs while Arthur hauls meat and John breaks horses. Mary Beth teaches Jack to read, Tilly plays cards with him, Hosea tells him stories about far-off places. Jack chases fireflies, plays with his toy boat, and runs between tents while the adults plan robberies that pay for his toys and his books. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, yet around that central fire, it looks almost normal, almost safe. Dutch takes enormous pride in this image. He points to the women and children as justification, as proof that the gang is more than criminals, that their crimes are a necessary evil in a rigged world. He bristles when anyone threatens them, calls them his responsibility, his sacred charge. But as the story of 1899 darkens, his choices drag them into the line of fire. Jack's kidnapping in Rhodes is not an accident. It is a direct consequence of Dutch inserting his family into a feud between plantation dynasties. Abigail's pleas to leave only harden his resolve. He cannot admit that his dream is what endangers them. So those quiet moments at camp gain a terrible weight. Karen drunk on a crate, forcing laughter as Pinkertons close in. Tilly whispering about a better life in St. Denis. Jack playing with a wooden horse outside a tent in Shady Belle, while Arthur returns splattered in someone else's blood. Every domestic detail becomes a reminder of how much there is to lose when the dream collapses. And collapse it will. The question is not if the illusion of safety breaks, but where and who Dutch is willing to sacrifice when the family he built from its humble beginnings becomes the last thing standing between his ideals and his delusions. For all Dutch's speeches about destiny and civilization, the illusion of home rests on smaller shoulders. The grand philosophy may belong to Dutch and Hosea, but the day-to-day survival of this outlaw family is a story of half-burnt stew, dirty laundry, and a man who will do almost anything to avoid lifting a finger. Uncle is the camp's resident loafer, the self-proclaimed veteran of 100 half-remembered wars and 1,000 hangovers. He claims to have seen the world, to have ridden with legends, to have stared down death more times than he can count. Yet when there is wood to chop or wagons to repair, he somehow develops a mysterious back problem. Arthur hauls carcasses in from the hills. Uncle leans on a post, nursing a bottle, spinning tall tales that change every time he tells them. In the truest sense, he is the living embodiment of the gang's myth-making, all bluster, all story, barely held together by liquor and luck. If Uncle is the camp's comic laziness, Pearson is its grumbling backbone. A former Navy quartermaster turned butcher, he runs the stew pot with the discipline of a ship's galley and the complaints of a man who believes no one appreciates his genius. He brags about serving on a whaling vessel, about storms that nearly swallowed him whole, about ports that promised freedom and delivered only disappointment. Now his ocean is a bubbling cauldron, his crew a band of outlaws who forget to bring in game until the pot is nearly empty. Arthur's hunting trips are not just gameplay mechanics, they are negotiations of respect. Bring Pearson prime venison or a perfect pelt, and the old sailor softens, sharing another story of the sea while the aroma of stew drifts through camp. Come back empty-handed, and the complaints start, about Dutch's leadership, about the gang's waste, about how the world was changing and men had lost the discipline they once had at sea. Through those exchanges, a quiet hierarchy emerges, measured not only in guns drawn, but in meat delivered and chores finished. Around the fire, the gang becomes something closer to a real community. Card games flare into friendly rivalries. Javier sings mournful ballads from his homeland. Bill, drunk and defensive, tries to prove he belongs, while Karen and Tilly trade barbs that reveal affection under the sting. On some nights, the laughter grows loud enough to drown out the gunfire echoing in their memories. On others, a single song carries across the trees, fragile and hopeful, as if the old ways were dying and everyone knows it, but refuses to say it aloud. These scenes of domestic routine can feel almost peaceful, yet every pot Pearson stirs has been paid for with a robbery. Every bottle Uncle drains was bought with someone else's fear. Each shared meal, each drunken chorus, is funded by blood on Arthur's hands and bounties on their heads. From its humble beginnings, this camp was never just a home. It was a hideout on borrowed time, a fragile refuge that will not survive once betrayal, hunger. And Dutch's growing delusions finally pushed this family past the point of no return. That borrowed time has an enemy. It does not ride on horseback, or sleep under the stars, or argue around a campfire. It runs on iron rails, hums along copper wire, and prints its judgments in ink for the whole world to read. The world was changing, and the gang's way of life is being hunted by progress itself. Railroads stitch the continent together, turning once isolated territories into a single, connected market and, more importantly, a single jurisdiction. A train that brings rich men to Saint Denis also brings marshals, Pinkerton agents, and armored safes. Telegraph lines race beside the tracks, carrying descriptions, bounties, and rumors faster than the fastest Arabian the gang could ever steal. A robbery at Horseshoe Overlook can be in the Saint Denis Times by morning, and on a wanted poster in Annisburg by night. The game quietly shows this new reality in the smallest details. Step into a post office after a big job, and the clerk might mention a daring train robbery up north. Pick up a newspaper in Valentine, and there is Dutch's gang of outlaws, reduced to a column about banditry and public nuisance, framed as part of a story of taming the frontier. Even the wanted posters nailed to sheriff office walls turn myth into paperwork, height, build, aliases, bounty. The living embodiment of Dutch's grand philosophy becomes, in the truest sense, a file to be processed. Into this tightening net rides a new kind of enemy. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency is not a posse chasing a legend, it is a corporation solving a problem. Milton and Ross arrive backed by federal contracts, legal authority, and near limitless patience. They track bank ledgers, follow train schedules, bribe informants, and read the same newspapers that talk about the gang's exploits. When Milton confronts Dutch and Hosea on the riverbank, he speaks not with awe, but with contempt, treating them as outdated criminals, blocking the road to civilization. This clash between outlaw romance and bureaucratic efficiency is everywhere. In Saint Denis, Arthur can overhear city folk discussing the Blackwater Ferry robbery as distant scandal, not campfire legend. In Annisburg, miners talk about lawmen cleaning up the region so industry can flourish. To the emerging industrial cities, the gang is not a story of freedom and rebellion. It is a security concern, a line item under bandit activity in some office far away. Dutch feels this pressure, but refuses to accept what it means. He rails against railroads, against barbed wire, against telegraphs, insisting that civilization is the true villain and that the old ways were dying only because people lost their nerve. Each new Pinkerton ambush becomes proof, in his mind, that his philosophy is right, not that it is failing. Why compromise when one last score could buy back the dream? Yet every train robbed tightens the noose. Every newspaper article spreads their infamy and narrows their options. This is the fault line that will define the gang's final years, an idealistic vision of outlaw freedom crashing headlong into a mechanized, organized world that has already decided there is no place left for lost soul families on the run. For the Vanderlinde Gang, this crashing collision between dream and reality takes on a rhythm, a pattern. Rob, vanish, regroup, repeat. From its humble beginnings, the gang survives by staying one step ahead, not just through gunfire, but through movement, misdirection, and a careful reading of a world that no longer wants them. The formula is simple in the truest sense, and yet strangely sophisticated. Dutch and Hosea case a target for days, sometimes weeks, a bank in Kansas, a railroad payroll in the Dakotas, a mining company office out in the New Austin territories. They strike hard and theatrical, leave a calling card in rumor and legend, then pull the entire camp up by the roots and disappear before civilization can properly react. Before Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, there were nameless camps in the Grizzlies, abandoned farms in the heartlands, and half-remembered cabins across the border, each one a ghost of an earlier score. From the very beginning, this is a story of repetition. Dutch hits a stagecoach company in Illinois, then hides the gang in river islands until the Pinkertons move on. Hosea cons a wealthy industrialist in Saint Denis years before 1899, then drags Dutch away when detectives start asking questions, even off-screen jobs mentioned only in campfire conversations. The time Arthur and Bill robbed a bank in Missouri, or when Javier helped Dutch derail a train in Nebraska, fit the same cycle: big score, bigger heat, sudden relocation. The gang's legend grows, but so does the list of places they can never return. Each new hideout is a strategic equation, not just a backdrop. Dutch chooses spots with access to rail lines for targets, forests or swamps for cover, and at least one quick escape route toward a border, river, or mountain pass. Early on, they favor open country and friendly locals, towns where Dutch's philosophy about freedom and corrupt elites still finds sympathetic ears. Yet there is another, quieter motive. Constant movement keeps everyone dependent on Dutch's vision, on Dutch's word that the next camp, the next job, will finally buy that mythical land where the gang can live as a family without fear. But the world was changing. Telegraph lines spread faster than horses can run, railroads knit distant cities into a single nervous system, and every spectacular robbery becomes headline news within hours. Jobs that once meant a few guards and a slow posse now come with armored cars, private security, and Pinkerton agents sharing information across states. The old ways were dying, and each new heist has to be bigger, riskier, more elaborate, just to keep pace with mounting bounties and dwindling safe havens. This escalating spiral narrows their options until one plan looms above the rest. A ferry in a booming town called Blackwater, carrying government bonds and guarded by men who underestimate an aging outlaw's desperation. To Dutch, it promises freedom. To Hosea, it feels wrong. To Arthur, it is another job in a long pattern. But this job will not end with a clean escape and a quiet new camp. This time, the cycle will shatter and turn the gang's well-practiced rhythm into the beginning of a death spiral no one in that campfire circle truly sees coming. The job in Saint Denis will shatter the illusion, but that illusion is built somewhere quieter, greener, and deceptively peaceful. Before the marble banks and electric lights, the gang's story settles for a time on a cliff above the heartlands, at a camp called Horseshoe Overlook. From its humble beginnings in the snowbound misery of Coulter, this open, sunlit camp feels almost like a reward. Tents ring the clearing, wagons form a rough perimeter, and beyond the edge of camp the world opens into rolling grass and train tracks cutting the horizon. It is the gang's most hopeful phase in 1899, a brief moment when Dutch can still point to the distance and promise freedom, when most of them still believe there is a future together. The old ways were dying down in the towns and rail depots, but up here, it almost seems that civilization is something that happens to other people. Daily life at Horseshoe Overlook becomes a story of routines and rituals. Pearson curses over the stew pot, swatting at flies and complaining about the quality of the meat. Uncle pretends to chop wood and mostly naps instead, the living embodiment of uselessness. At night, Karen and Sean drink and sing bawdy songs, while Javier strums his guitar and turns the campfire into a stage. In the background, Tilly and Mary Beth trade novels and gossip, and Strauss quietly hands out loans that will echo through the entire game's philosophy of debt and control. The camp seems, in the truest sense, like a functioning community. There are poker games at the table, with Lenny and Bill needling each other while Hosea tells stories that may or may not be true. There are chores to share, hunting parties heading out at dawn, laundry hung between trees. Even the inside jokes, Micah grumbling about his tent placement, Sean bragging about robberies no one quite remembers, create a feeling of family. But how much of that warmth is real, and how much is everyone pretending the cracks are not there? Arthur moves through this world as mediator and workhorse. He hauls bales, hunts game, collects debts, and drifts from one clique to another, equally at home listening to Hosea's weary wisdom, roughhousing with Sean, or checking on the quieter members who rarely speak up. When tempers flare, Arthur calms Bill, reins in Micah, or walks John away from another argument with Abigail. For a while, his presence holds the center. Yet Horseshoe Overlook is already haunted by what is coming. Dutch talks more and more about one big score, about Saint Denis and opportunity, chasing dreams that are starting to sound like delusions. John disappears on scouting trips, pushing away from camp, while Abigail's frustration hardens into open resentment. Around the edges, there are murmurs, Tilly's doubts, Charles's concern. Hosea's quiet questions about Dutch's changing philosophy. In hindsight, this is the last time the gang truly lives in the open as a family. No swamp fog, no cave shadows, no sense of being hunted yet. Just a clear view of the heartlands and a future that seems, for one fragile chapter, almost within reach. The next move, to Clement's point, will bring them closer to money, power, and the South's decaying plantations, and much closer to the point where loyalty begins to bend toward betrayal. From that clear view of the heartlands, the shadow of a place no one can see on screen still hangs over everything: Blackwater. The story at Horseshoe Overlook begins with sunlight and open skies, but it is haunted from the very beginning by a job the game never actually shows. The most important robbery in the gang's history is a ghost, mentioned in fragments, felt in every argument, and written in blood across the opening hours. By the time the gang rides into Coulter in the prologue, the Blackwater disaster has already happened. They are freezing, starving, and on the run, not from some vague trouble, but from a very specific catastrophe. Dialogue around camp, stray remarks from Pinkertons, and even newspapers picked up in the world all point to the same event: a ferry robbery in the booming town of Blackwater, a last big score aimed at a boat loaded with cash and bonds. Dutch went after the future of money in a modernizing port, and it blew up in his face. Pieces of the night come out in conversation. There was a plan to hit the boat and escape clean with a fortune. There was a botched withdrawal under fire. There was a panicked retreat to the docks. Lawmen talk about civilians gunned down on the water. One detail stands out above all the rest. In the chaos, Dutch shot an innocent woman. Not an armed guard, not a rival outlaw, but a bystander. A lost soul who just happened to be in the wrong place when Dutch's dream of freedom turned into a nightmare. That single act is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, compressed into one trigger pull. Strategically, Blackwater shows how far Dutch has drifted from his earlier philosophy. From its humble beginnings, the gang robbed stagecoaches and backroom card games, talking about taking from the rich and corrupt. Now Dutch is willing to risk the entire family, in the truest sense, on a crowded ferry in a modern town crawling with Pinkertons. Morally, crossing the line into killing an unarmed woman shatters the myth he sells about codes and civilization. Different members carry that failure in different ways. Hosea is shaken, quieter, the living embodiment of doubt. His gentle warnings harden into open concern, as if he knows the old ways were dying the moment that shot rang out. Arthur tries to rationalize it, framing Blackwater as a bad turn in an otherwise righteous struggle. But his journal and later reflections hint that something fundamental broke in his faith. John, half absent from the job and half blamed for it, begins to see Dutch not as an untouchable genius, but as a man slipping, making desperate choices he cannot control. The bounty that follows is enormous, the law's response relentless. Every new camp, from Coulter's blizzard to Clemens Point's southern haze, is chosen under pressure from that unseen ferry. Blackwater becomes the moment the dream is mortally wounded, even if the gang refuses to admit it. How can a family built on freedom survive when its founding philosophy dies on a boat it never shows? That unanswered question follows them into the South, where old money, new power, and Dutch's next grand schemes will drive the fracture even deeper. Blackwater is the wound, but the infection enters the gang months before, in the form of a man who was not there from the very beginning. Micah Bell does not grow with the Vanderlinde Gang from its humble beginnings. He arrives late. A drifter with a cruel smile, joining only about 6 months before the ferry job that shatters everything. In a world where most of Dutch's people have bled for him for years, that timing matters. Arthur, taken in as a teenager, is in the truest sense Dutch's first son. John has ridden with them since he was a boy. Bill, Javier, even the newer faces like Charles and Sadie, are drawn into a story of shared hardship and earned loyalty. Micah, by contrast, is almost a stranger, a man whose past is hinted at only in fragments of bounty posters and throwaway lines about his father swinging from a tree. From the moment he appears, his personality cuts against the gang's older rhythm, where Hosea is pragmatic, careful, always weighing risk against survival. Micah is reckless and hungry for chaos. Where Arthur is a weary professional, treating robbery as work to be done cleanly, Micah revels in pain, taunting victims, pushing for unnecessary bloodshed, turning every job into a performance. He is the living embodiment of violence without philosophy. It is no accident that he latches onto Dutch. Micah understands ego. He flatters Dutch's speeches, praises his big plans, and presents himself as the only man truly willing to do what needs to be done. When others question Dutch's grand schemes, Micah leans in and whispers that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and only Dutch is bold enough to fight civilization itself. Who resists a mirror that always shows greatness? The trip to Strawberry is the clearest early warning. Micah gets himself arrested in a pointless spree, dragging Dutch and Arthur into a rescue that spirals into a burning jail, dead lawmen, and terrified townsfolk fleeing through the streets. Micah laughs through it, goading Arthur to shoot more, mocking any hesitation. The gang escapes, but the damage is deeper than bullet holes. Dutch has indulged Micah's chaos, and the gang pays the price. Around the campfire, Micah's poison spreads in quieter ways. He needles Bill about cowardice, questions Javier's loyalty, hints that Arthur is losing his nerve. Each jibe feeds Dutch's growing paranoia that his oldest followers are becoming soft, or worse, disloyal. Micah offers a simple solution: trust the man who never flinches. Never doubts, never says no. His late arrival and rapid rise are not random twists of fate. They are symptoms of a shift inside Dutch himself, a turn from idealistic outlaw philosopher to wounded egotist seeking validation. As Blackwater fades into a haunted memory and the gang rides south toward the plantations and parlors of Lemoyne, one question hangs in the air in the battles to come. Whose voice will Dutch hear more clearly, Arthur's caution or Micah's whisper? The answer will decide who lives and who is marked for betrayal. As the gang leaves the blood and smoke of Saint Denis behind, their next chapter does not begin with a daring robbery or a bold speech. It begins with a storm, the Blackwater disaster, that unseen catastrophe, haunting every conversation, finally cashes in its debt as the Vanderlinde Gang flees into the frozen teeth of the grizzlies. They drag wagons up mountain trails not meant for wheels, horses stumbling, men half-starved and half-mad with exhaustion. Wounded from Blackwater, hunted by Pinkertons and local lawmen, they push higher into the blizzard because there is nowhere else to go. This is not the glamorous freedom Dutch once promised. This is survival in the truest sense, a story of bodies pressed against the wind while dreams of easy money freeze in their throats. Coulter, at first glance, is only a half-abandoned mining settlement, a few shacks, a dead main street, a church with no congregation. Yet in that moment, it becomes the living embodiment of the gang's new reality. The cramped, freezing cabins where they huddle together are more than shelter. They are a visual metaphor, 4 wooden walls closing in around a family whose options are shrinking as fast as the daylight. Inside, the hierarchy bends under the weight of the storm. Hosea, once the calm strategist, can offer little more than quiet counsel and weary warnings. Dutch, wrapped in a heavy coat and heavier denial, paces and preaches about faith and destiny, trying to sound certain while the wind outside howls with his doubt. His philosophy, once expansive and idealistic, now has to explain why children are shivering in the dark. Then John disappears into the white void, and Coulter turns from refuge into test. Arthur and Javier ride out into the storm, their silhouettes swallowed by snow, searching for a man who had already begun to drift from the gang's center. Arthur's decision to risk his life for John is one of his earliest, clearest acts of loyalty, a reminder that beneath Dutch's rhetoric, real bonds still exist. When John is finally found, torn by wolves and half-frozen, the image lingers, an outlaw reduced to a crawling, hoarse-voiced survivor, dragged back from the edge. In that isolation, new dynamics crystallize. Micah gains favor by charging into danger, volunteering for scouting and violence, speaking the bold words Dutch needs to hear. Hosea's influence fades in the blizzard's silence, his cautions drowned out by the immediate need for food, fire, and ammunition. Weaker members whisper about leaving, about surrender, about whether this outlaw family has a future at all. The questions are quiet, but they are there. Coulter marks the first true fracture point. Here, survival pushes philosophy into the corner. Here, the old ways were dying even if Dutch refuses to see it. As the snow finally begins to thaw and the gang looks south toward Horseshoe Overlook, the storm has already done its work. The world was changing, and from its humble beginnings in those frozen shacks, the gang's downward spiral has truly begun. Yet another question waits on the other side of the pass. When the sun returns and the coats come off, will Dutch remember Coulter's lessons, or only its excuses? The thaw brings a lie with it. As the snow melts and the gang rides out of Coulter toward the open green of the Heartlands, it feels less like an escape from disaster and more like a triumphant return to the world that once seemed made for outlaws. Horseshoe Overlook, above the little cattle town of Valentine, becomes the stage for this illusion of normalcy. The camp breathes again. The wind is softer, the food is better, the clothes are clean, and the gang slips back into its old rhythm, scouting trains, robbing stagecoaches, playing poker under lantern light, and staggering home drunk from the saloon. For a moment, it is a story of recovery, of momentum reclaimed after Blackwater's unseen catastrophe. Dutch seizes on that feeling. Every early success around Valentine becomes evidence, in his mind, that his philosophy still works. A simple train robbery with Hosea and Arthur goes right, the take is good, the Pinkertons do not immediately descend. Dutch stands in the glow of the campfire and insists Blackwater was a fluke, a mistake that will be erased by one more perfect score. Freedom, family, and revenge against civilization's hypocrisy all blur into a single promise: stay loyal, and the dream returns. Valentine itself becomes the living embodiment of that promise. The infamous bar brawl, where Bill Williamson's drunken, posturing spirals into a full-on melee, feels almost comedic. Men crash through windows, Arthur is thrown into mud and horse troughs, and for a few chaotic minutes, the gang is not hunted fugitives but rowdy regulars in a frontier town. The world was changing, yet in that bar, the old ways were not just alive, they were celebrated. But beneath the laughter, the rod is already there. Arthur's debt-collecting missions for Strauss send him into the homes of desperate farmers and sick laborers, and the cost of the gang's survival becomes harder to ignore. For the first time, he sees the collateral damage up close: a coughing husband whose illness will spread, a family pushed toward ruin because Dutch's ideals need funding. Is this rebellion or simple predation dressed up as politics? Arthur's interactions in Valentine reveal his contradictions in the truest sense. He can beat a man half to death in an alley, then gently help a stranger load a wagon or calm a frightened horse. He is enforcer and caretaker, lost soul and reluctant guardian, struggling between freedom and civilization even as Dutch demands absolute obedience. The warning signs sharpen. Dutch begins talking not about safe jobs, but larger, riskier scores. Micah, who arrived only months before, whispers in his ear, pushing bolder violence while Hosea's caution is brushed aside. From its humble beginnings as a simple camp above a quiet town, Horseshoe Overlook becomes a crossroads, loyalty on one side, betrayal on the other. Valentine stands as a deceptive high point, a brief return to the gang's golden rhythm that hides how much has already changed. The old ways were dying, even as Dutch pretended they could be resurrected with dynamite and speeches. The next moves, toward Rhodes and the blood-soaked games of the Lemoyne elite, will show just how fragile that illusion always was. Valentine is the last time the gang can pretend it is just having fun, but back at Horseshoe Overlook, the real story is not the brawls or the poker games. It is the quiet negotiations of power around the campfire. This is where the Vanderlinde Gang stops being only a band of outlaws and becomes, in the truest sense, a fragile little civilization. On paper, the hierarchy is simple. Dutch stands at the top, the visionary leader, the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy of freedom against a rigged world. Hosea is his shadow and his balance, the strategist who turns speeches into workable plans and reckless dreams into survivable robberies. Arthur sits just beneath them, the trusted enforcer and reluctant mediator, the man who can drag Bill out of a drunken rage, calm Javier's pride, or talk John down when his resentment boils over. Around that core, the muscle forms an orbit: John, Bill, Javier, and increasingly Micah, each vying for Dutch's approval in their own way. Yet true power in this camp is not only carried in guns, it also hides in ledgers, in chores, in who eats first and who sleeps where. Leopold Strauss, the quiet Austrian loan shark, almost never raises his voice. But his money keeps the ammunition flowing and the wagons moving. Those cold little promissory notes he sends Arthur to collect do more than fund the camp. They tie the gang to the suffering of the world outside, revealing how far Dutch's idealistic rhetoric has drifted into delusions of grandeur. Strauss cannot challenge Dutch in public, but by controlling the purse. He shapes which plans are possible and which remain just talk. Then there is Susan Grimshaw, the camp's iron matriarch. From its humble beginnings, the gang survives because someone is folding the clothes, rationing the food, and telling men with guns to pick up a damn bucket. Grimshaw patrols the tents with a shotgun and a sharp tongue, enforcing rules that keep disease, idleness, and chaos at bay. She scolds Molly for sulking, slaps Pearson into line when he drinks too much, and even drags Arthur and John into chores when they forget that freedom without responsibility is just another form of selfishness. When Dutch drifts off into speeches, Grimshaw makes sure the women and children are fed. Only a few can truly challenge Dutch, and even they must choose their moments. Hosea argues with him in private, behind closed tent flaps, questioning the wisdom of Valentine bar fights and grand bank jobs in a world that was changing faster than Dutch will admit. Arthur pushes back in quieter ways, doubting Micah's influence, questioning the morality of Strauss's loans, asking, again and again, what all this is really for. Others do not dare. Bill falls silent when Dutch raises his voice, Javier folds his arms and watches, and even proud John usually swallows his anger when the speeches start to flow. For now, there is a balance. Dutch's charisma, Hosea's caution, Arthur's conscience, Strauss's money, Grimshaw's discipline, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, held together by habit and shared history. But those same habits hide fault lines. When Dutch's paranoia deepens, when loyalty becomes a test instead of a given, when Micah whispers and Dutch starts playing favorites, who will the camp listen to then? The answer will turn Rhodes from a temporary hideout into the first true battlefield for the gang's soul. Those fault lines are not only carved by gunfights and bank jobs. Some of the deepest cracks in the Vanderlinde Gang run quietly through a leather-bound book on Leopold Strauss's desk. In that ledger, the gang's philosophy is translated into cold numbers, and the distance between Dutch's words and the camp's reality becomes impossible to ignore. Strauss is the gang's financier in the truest sense, the man who never rides into town with a mask but bleeds it dry all the same. From its humble beginnings, the gang claimed to rob the rich and corrupt, yet Strauss's work targets the opposite: poor farmers, immigrants, widows, men already one bad harvest away from ruin. He offers small, predatory loans with impossible interest, and when the due date comes, he sends an enforcer. More often than not, that enforcer is Arthur Morgan. At first, Arthur treats these collections as routine work, another chore between train robberies and campfire stories. Ride out, knock on a door, lean on some desperate soul until the money or the collateral appears. In early missions, he intimidates a down-on-his-luck farmer, shakes down a couple arguing over how to feed their children, and takes heirlooms from people who have nothing else left. It is presented as business. But the world was changing, and these small jobs carry consequences that echo far beyond the camp. The most devastating comes in the fields of a poor debtor named Thomas Downs. Arthur confronts him for Strauss, shoving a sick, exhausted man against a fence as Downs coughs blood into Arthur's face. The scene feels almost mundane at the time, just another mark in a long list of names. Only later does it reveal itself as a turning point. The moment when Arthur contracts tuberculosis and his own death sentence is quietly written into Strauss's ledger. A story of numbers on a page becomes a story of life and death. As Arthur returns to these homes, he witnesses the fallout. Edith Downs forced into prostitution in Annisburg, their son Archie humiliated and beaten, proud families reduced to begging because the gang that once claimed to fight civilization's cruelty has become its mirror. Struggling between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization, Arthur begins to see that the gang is no longer the living embodiment of resistance, but a parasite feeding on the same poor it once claimed as allies. How different are they from the bankers and railroad men now? Dutch, meanwhile, largely ignores Strauss's cruelty, or rationalizes it as necessary. He talks of grand scores and future utopias, dismissing the ledger as housekeeping while he chases ever bigger dreams and deeper delusions. When Arthur questions the work, Dutch deflects, insisting that everyone must pull their weight, that the old ways were dying and hard choices must be made. It is betrayal, not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small approvals. By the time Arthur's illness forces him to confront his own past, Strauss's ledger reads less like an account book and more like a quiet record of sins. Each entry marks another step away from the very beginning, when Dutch and Hosea swore to only prey on the corrupt, and toward a gang that exploits the weakest people in the world they once vowed to protect. The numbers do not lie, they simply wait, pointing toward a reckoning the camp can no longer outrun. Those numbers in Strauss's ledger point to a reckoning. Saint Denis gives it a stage. From its humble beginnings as a distant name on a map, the city becomes the living embodiment of everything the gang has been running from: law, order, industry, and a new kind of power that cannot be outgunned. Saint Denis is not a town, it is a machine. Trams rattle past cobblestone streets, factories belch smoke into a gray sky, and electric lights burn through the night as if to deny the very existence of darkness. This is civilization in the truest sense, or at least its most confident costume, and the world was changing faster here than Dutch's old philosophy can keep up. The gang that once camped under open skies now rides into a maze of alleyways, telegraph wires, and strangers who do not even look twice at armed outlaws. Dutch feels that insult as much as the danger. To him, Saint Denis is proof that the old ways were dying, that men in suits and top hats have replaced sheriffs and posses with banks, corporations, and Pinkertons on permanent retainer. So, he reframes the threat as opportunity. Angelo Bronte, the Italian crime boss who owns half the city by fear and favors, becomes, in Dutch's telling, the final key. Dutch promises that if they can infiltrate this world of mansions and garden parties through Bronte, one last score will buy their freedom forever. It is a story of escape dangled in front of exhausted men and women who have run out of roads. Arthur's reaction reveals the cost of that dream. His journal records Saint Denis with a mixture of awe and unease, the noise, the crowds, the smoke, the feeling that the horizon has been replaced by brick and steel. He walks past street performers, newsboys, and immigrant dock workers, and senses that the frontier he knew has already been buried here. Is there room for an outlaw in a world that barely notices him? Or is he already a relic wandering through a future that has no place for his kind? Dutch, however, leans in. Working with Bronte means tolerating child kidnapping, political blackmail, and quiet exploitation that makes even Arthur flinch. Dutch attends Bronte's parties, flatters his ego, and accepts humiliations that the younger Dutch would have met with gunfire. Each compromise is explained as part of the bigger picture, each betrayal of his own code wrapped in speeches about family, loyalty, and destiny. The man who once swore never to prey on the weak now smiles at the table of a man who does it for sport. Saint Denis becomes the mirage on the horizon. Bright lights, big promises, no water. Here Dutch makes his boldest vows, talks of Tahiti and retirement with a fevered certainty. And here those dreams begin to collapse under the weight of reality. The city's trams and telephones move faster than his plans. Its Pinkertons and politicians hit harder than his rhetoric. The bank on the corner, the mansion by the park, the very streets themselves are already waiting to turn his greatest scheme into his most catastrophic failure, and the gang's last illusions into smoke. The reckoning is no longer abstract. It has an address, a skyline, and a timetable that Dutch cannot control. Saint Denis turns Dutch's favorite fantasy into his final sales pitch. One last job, one last score, and then freedom. That is the promise echoing through camp as he unveils the Saint Denis bank heist as the key to Tahiti, to mangoes and sunshine, to a world where the gang can finally stop running and simply exist. From its humble beginnings as a whispered idea, the plan grows into the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. He has inside information from Angelo Bronte's circle about the bank's layout and security. He has the city cased, the escape routes mapped, the roles assigned with theatrical precision. It is, in the truest sense, Dutch trying to prove that his mind is still sharper than the noose tightening around them. Hosea will pose as a wealthy investor to distract the law, Arthur and the others will hit the vault, and Dutch will conduct it all as if directing a play. At first, it works. The doors close, the tellers flinch, the vault yields to dynamite and discipline. Lenny moves through the lobby with practiced calm, Arthur stacks bonds and cash, and for a flicker of time it feels like the old days, when the world was changing but the gang could still stay one step ahead. Dutch's voice is steady, his confidence infectious. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but in that moment the dream still looks real. Then the doors open, not to freedom, but to civilization in uniform. Lawmen and Pinkertons swarm the street outside, rifles leveled, names already on their tongues. Milton and his men have outmaneuvered the outlaws completely, revealing that this city plays by different rules, with telegraphs, informants, and politicians who have been waiting for Dutch to make exactly this move. The bank is no longer a stage. It is a trap. Outside, Hosea pays the price for Dutch's gamble. Captured in the square, he faces Milton not as a legendary conman, but as an old man whose warnings have been ignored. Hosea's death, executed in front of the gang, is more than a bullet. It is the silencing of Dutch's conscience. The end of the voice that once urged patience, subtlety, and mercy. When Hosea falls, a whole era of the gang falls with him. Dutch's response is not reflection, it is fury. Instead of questioning his own miscalculations, he rages about betrayal, about Bronte's treachery, about bad luck and stacked decks. The old ways were dying, but Dutch refuses to admit that his philosophy has died with them. In his mind, someone else must always be to blame. The escape is chaos. Lenny is gunned down on a rooftop, another lost soul ripped from the family in an instant. The gang scatters through alleys, sewers, and over tiles, slick with rain and blood, their dream bleeding out on St. Denis' cobblestones as bells ring and whistles scream. They vanish into the night, not as triumphant outlaws bound for paradise, but as hunted fugitives clinging to a leader who has just proven he can no longer see the difference. Where can a gang run when the frontier is gone, the city has beaten them, and their guiding star has started to burn out? The answer in Dutch's mind is simple: farther. When St. Denis spits them out in smoke and sirens, the gang does not ride for the next valley or the next state. A handful of them are hurled out of the world they know entirely. The escape turns into disaster on the docks, a botched flight under gunfire that ends with Arthur, Dutch, Javier, Bill, and Micah trapped on a ship, surrounded, and then wrecked by a storm. One moment, they are outlaws in a modern city, staring down Pinkertons and electric lights. The next, they wash ashore on Guarma, a Caribbean island that feels, in the truest sense, like a hallucination torn from a different story of empire and rebellion. Guarma is lush and suffocating, a place where the jungle presses in and civilization wears a far crueler mask. Spanish-speaking overseers work enslaved laborers on sugar plantations, and the air is thick with heat, mosquitoes, and gun smoke. The world was changing in America. The old ways were dying under railroads and banks, but here, the old brutality of colonial power is still the living embodiment of law. Dutch, who once railed against the tyranny of Leviticus Cornwall, suddenly finds a whole island ruled by men even worse. For a brief moment, it seems perfect for him. A ready-made revolution, a desperate rebel leader in Hercule, and a clear villain in Colonel Fussar. Dutch steps into it with theatrical ease, promising freedom, promising victory, promising that the Vanderlinde Gang will tip the scales of history. He talks of philosophy and destiny, of shared struggle and family across borders. Yet every promise is paid for in someone else's blood. On Guarma, his unraveling stops being subtle. Dutch pushes the rebels into bolder attacks, escalates the violence, and shows almost no concern for the lives of the workers he claims to liberate. When a plan goes wrong, he blames traitors, not his own arrogance. When men die following his orders, he calls it necessary sacrifice. Is this still the idealistic dreamer from its humble beginnings, or a man addicted to chaos? Arthur stumbles through all of this half broken, half awake. He is sick from exhaustion, malaria, and grief, watching Dutch's grand speeches grow more hollow as the jungle closes in. Guarma becomes a fever dream for him, a place where the gap between Dutch's words and actions is impossible to ignore. The more Dutch talks of loyalty and freedom, the more Arthur sees betrayal and delusions. When they finally escape Guarma and return to the mainland, nothing has been healed. Dutch brings back no clarity, only paranoia, a taste for senseless killing, and a new habit of seeing enemies everywhere. The island does not save the gang, it poisons the well. From that moment on, every campfire in Beaver Hollow will carry the echo of jungle gunfire, and every plan will feel less like a strategy and more like the last, frantic moves of a lost soul. If Guarma was a fever, what happens when the patient insists the sickness is everyone else? If Guarma was the fever dream, Shady Belle is the sickbed. The gang returns from the island not to a fresh start, but to a rotting southern manor, half drowned in swamp water and half buried in the past. It is, in the truest sense, a story of a family moving into a mausoleum and pretending it is still a home. Shady Bell once belonged to Confederate officers. Now it stands as a decaying monument to lost causes and failed rebellions. Bullet holes scar the plaster, mold creeps along the ceilings, and whole rooms are flooded so deeply that candles reflect in stagnant water. The Civil War is over, the old ways were dying, and yet the gang chooses to hide among its remnants, living inside the ruins of someone else's broken dreams. From its humble beginnings in the open hills, this is where the Vanderlinde philosophy quite literally takes shelter in a dead ideology. Life here feels cramped and airless. The camp that once sprawled across sunny fields is now compressed into narrow halls and cluttered porches, where every whispered argument seems to echo off the walls. Food is scarce, money is tight, and trust is even tighter. Dutch retreats to an upstairs bedroom, pacing between maps and whiskey bottles, while the others huddle downstairs, trading rumors about Pinkertons and betrayals. The man who preached freedom now locks himself away, a general without an army, a visionary without daylight. That physical constriction is not an accident. Rockstar's level design turns Shady Bell into a visual thesis. The world was changing, civilization was closing in, and the gang's dreams no longer fit the space they occupied. Lanterns throw long, trembling shadows across warped floorboards, and even the front steps feel more like the threshold of a crypt than the entrance to a camp. How far is this from the open fires of Horseshoe Overlook, where the sky seemed to go on forever? Then comes Beaver Hollow, and the House of Ghosts is traded for a hole in the earth. The final camp is not a ranch, not a cabin, not even a shack. It is a damp cave complex buried deep within the Roanoke Ridge woods, hidden under roots and rock, where the gang becomes the living embodiment of its own paranoia. They do not just hide from the world, they crawl under it. Beaver Hollow is all narrow passages, dripping ceilings, and low, oppressive roofs that force men who once rode under endless skies to duck their heads. Rain never really stops here. It patters on leaves, seeps through cracks, mixes with the smoke of dying campfires. Distant animal howls and the constant hiss of the forest replace the music and laughter that once carried across the heartlands. Even the light feels sick, filtered through moss and fog, flickering on faces that no longer trust one another. Metatextually, every move from Coulter to Horseshoe Overlook, from Clemens Point to Shady Bell, and finally to Beaver Hollow charts the gang's moral descent. Open vistas give way to swamps, then to caves, warm campfires become cold lanterns, and then guttering torches. Even without a single line of dialogue, the geography tells the story. This outlaw family is shrinking, collapsing inward, being swallowed by its own delusions. By the time Arthur walks those twisting tunnels, the camp is less a headquarters and more a tomb in progress. So when the Pinkertons finally come knocking, is it an invasion or just the outside world arriving to seal a grave that was already dug? Beaver Hollow is a grave, but Dutch refuses to read the headstones. As the walls close in, his words try to push them back, turning that rotting cave into a pulpit where reality is the only thing not invited. From its humble beginnings, his rhetoric had been the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy: freedom, family, resistance to a corrupt civilization. In the early days, have a little faith meant something. One more score sounded like a plan, not a curse. Now, in the truest sense, those same phrases echo through the damp tunnels as ghosts, repeated so often they lose all weight. Every setback is met with the same refrain: the next job in St. Denis, the next shipment in Guarma, the next deal with Angelo Bronte or the army. One more score, one more miracle, one more lie. By Beaver Hollow, the pattern is undeniable. When the train robbery at Cornwall Kerosene and Tar turns bloody, Dutch blames the company and the law. When the St. Denis bank heist gets Hosea and Lenny killed, he blames the Pinkertons and the tyranny of government. When the Tahiti dream dissolves into Guarma's nightmare, he blames fate itself. At no point does he stand in that cave and admit that his own decisions have dragged this outlaw family to the edge. Is it conviction, or is it fear of what the truth would do to him? His late-game speeches become a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but the roles are reversed. The betrayers are not the leaders who broke the code. They are the followers who dare to question. Arthur asks what happened to the money from Blackwater, to the promise of getting the women and children out. John asks why the family keeps being thrown into hopeless gunfights. Dutch answers with volume, not honesty. He talks about rats, about disloyalty, about how the world was changing and closing in. He never talks about Dutch. The contrast is stark. At Horseshoe Overlook, Arthur stands near the fire and nods along, half believing, half wanting to believe. By Beaver Hollow, he trades tired, skeptical looks with John and Charles as Dutch launches into yet another tirade about faith. That shift in their eyes tells the whole story. The old ways were dying, but Dutch's speeches pretend time itself is the traitor. Into this echo chamber steps Micah Bell, perfectly suited to the decay. Where others flinch, he applauds. Every paranoid accusation Dutch makes, Micah confirms. Every doubt Arthur voices, Micah twists into treason. He calls the cautious cowards, the questioning rats, and in doing so he builds a wall around Dutch, brick by flattering brick. Two men, both insisting they see the world clearly, are in fact robbing each other of the last scraps of honesty. By the time Dutch stands over the gang in that dark cavern, his rhetoric is a hollow shell, a ghost of ideals that once tried to guide and protect. Now, those same words exist to control, to justify, to keep the myth of Dutch Vanderlinde alive even as the man himself slips away. The question is no longer whether his followers believe him. It is what happens when he finally realizes that he does not even believe himself. And the answer to that comes with a gun in his hand, a cliff at his back, and every betrayal laid bare. That answer does not come all at once with a final showdown. It begins quietly, in a cramped house in Annisburg, with a coughing fit and a man too proud to admit he is already dying. Arthur contracts tuberculosis during what should be a routine debt collection for Strauss, shaking down a desperate miner named Thomas Downs. The scene is almost mundane at first, an outlaw looming over a starving family, a man who has nothing left to give. A philosophy of the gang comes first pressed onto the throat of the poor. Then Downs coughs blood into Arthur's face. In that instant, the gang's entire economy of exploitation brands itself into Arthur's lungs. From that moment, every wheeze is a reminder that the gang's survival has been paid for by people who never had a chance. The world was changing, civilization tightening its grip, and Dutch's so-called rebellion has reduced Arthur to an enforcer for predatory loans. Arthur's body fails as Dutch's ideals fail. His physical decline becomes the living embodiment of the gang's moral collapse. At the very beginning, Dutch and Hosea promised Arthur freedom, family, and purpose. Now, as the disease advances, those promises unravel. His journal shifts from sketches of camp life and half-romantic musings on Dutch's philosophy to raw, pained reflections. He writes about Strauss's business, about the Downs family, about the nagging sense that their victims are not villains but casualties. "I'm not a good man," he scrawls, wrestling with the truth that he has been Dutch's sword and shield in a story of betrayal disguised as loyalty. Pattern interrupt, the toughest gun in the gang, the man who is killed without hesitation, suddenly finds himself haunted not by shootouts, but by children. He watches Jack reading by the fire, hears John and Abigail argue about leaving, and realizes the gang's camp is no place for a boy to grow up. He remembers the Downs' young son, Archie, staring at him in terror. How many children has this life scarred beyond repair? As his lungs weaken, his clarity sharpens. He starts refusing Strauss's work, confronting Dutch over the deaths piling up, and questioning plans that once would have thrilled him. Money loses its shine. The dream of one last score, one last escape, one last miracle is revealed as just that, a dream. The old ways were dying, and Arthur finally understands that Dutch is clinging to a fantasy that can only end in blood. In the truest sense, tuberculosis becomes Arthur's unwanted teacher. Facing a terminal sentence, he redirects his remaining strength toward John, Abigail, and Jack, pushing John to run, to change, to break the cycle. The most loyal soldier turns his back on the cause, not out of betrayal, but out of love. His illness is not only a tragedy, it is the narrative blade that cuts through years of delusion and forces the gang's staunchest believer to ask the question he has avoided his whole life. What has he really been fighting for? The answer to that question will decide who, if anyone, escapes Dutch's collapsing world. Arthur's question hangs over the camp, but for John Marston, the answer has already begun to take shape. His story becomes the mirror image of Dutch's. While one man doubles down on a dying dream, the other quietly plans his exit. It is a story of freedom redefined, of family rediscovered, of an outlaw trying to build something that civilization will not have to tear down. From the very beginning of 1899, Blackwater is the ghost at John's shoulder. He went into that ferry job as Dutch's eager proch and came out half dead, dragged from the water with scars that never fully heal. That near-death experience is not just a wound, it is a revelation. The gang's promises of safety, of a future for Jack, are exposed as illusions the moment Pinkertons and machine guns answer Dutch's philosophy of one last score. The world was changing, and John, for once, pays attention. Abigail has been paying attention for years. Her arguments with John in camp are not new fights, they are the latest rounds in a war that started when Jack was born. She has seen John ride out for Dutch, for Hosea, for every half-formed plan, and come back late or not at all. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, her words cut through the campfire camaraderie: be a father or be Dutch's gun. Not both. Her fear is practical and immediate. Jack is being raised in a world of gunshots, hangings, and broken promises, and she knows the old ways were dying long before Dutch admits it. John's earlier abandonment of the gang becomes Dutch's favorite weapon. When John disappears for months after Blackwater, Dutch frames it as proof that the boy he raised is a coward, a traitor, a lost soul who turned his back on family. When John returns at Coulter, half frozen and mauled by wolves, Dutch embraces him while quietly resetting the terms of their relationship. Gratitude is demanded. Guilt is cultivated. Every time John hesitates later, Dutch can point back and say, "Remember who found you, who nursed you, who forgave you." So when John starts talking again about leaving, about a ranch, about land and honest work, Dutch hears not hope, but betrayal. In the truest sense, Dutch believes the gang is John's real family, and that loyalty demands total sacrifice. A wife and child are, to him, secondary concerns, sentimental distractions from the larger cause. How could a cabin with a fence compete with a grand crusade against civilization? This is where Arthur's awakening intersects with John's exit strategy. As Arthur watches Dutch gamble, lives in St. Denis and Beaver Hollow, he sees John's choice not as cowardice, but as clarity. The man who once was the living embodiment of Arthur's ideals is revealed as something smaller, harsher, more afraid. In the end, when Arthur urges John to run, to take Abigail and Jack and disappear, it is the final, quiet betrayal of Dutch's dream, and the first true act of loyalty to what the gang was meant to protect. The stage is set, one son stays bound to the legend, the other breaks away to build a life beyond it. The next moves will decide which legacy survives. Arthur's choice to save John sets one path in motion. Hosea's absence and Micah's ascent twist the other. Between those two currents, the last remnants of Dutch's dream are about to be crushed. From the very beginning, Hosea Matthews had been more than Dutch's partner in crime. He was the quiet hand on the reins. Where Dutch's philosophy ran hot, romantic, and reckless, Hosea's ran cool, patient, and practical. In the early days, when a robbery went wrong or tempers flared, it was Hosea who talked Dutch down, who reminded him that the gang was family first and spectacle second. He was, in the truest sense, Dutch's conscience, the one voice Dutch would actually pause to hear. That balance dies on the steps of the St. Denis Bank. When Milton executes Hosea in front of Dutch, Arthur, and the world of civilization they thought they could outsmart, it is not only a friend's death. It is the removal of the only man who could look Dutch in the eye and say no without paying for it. From that moment on, every argument around the campfire, every desperate plan, happens with a gaping absence where Hosea's quiet skepticism used to sit. In the chaos that follows Guarma and the shattered return to Shady Belle, that absence becomes a vacuum, and vacuums do not stay empty for long. Micah Bell, who had arrived only months before Blackwater, steps into the space Hosea left with ruthless precision. Where Hosea once questioned, Micah affirms. Where Hosea urged patience, Micah demands action. His answers are simple, brutal, and flattering. Dutch is right, Dutch is strong, Dutch's enemies are everywhere. Why hesitate when the world was changing and the old ways were dying? By the time the gang reaches Beaver Hollow, the transformation is almost complete. The camp itself is a story of this shift. No longer an open, communal space, but a dark, cramped hollow where whispers travel faster than truth. Micah is constantly at Dutch's shoulder, leaning in, murmuring about traitors and cowards. After Arthur confronts Dutch about the Tahiti fantasy and the mounting bodies, Micah is there later, hissing that Arthur has turned, that his illness has made him weak. When John questions Dutch's decisions, Micah is ready with convenient evidence of John's disloyalty, twisting the Blackwater escape and Abigail's pleas into proof that John only ever cared for himself. Specific moments drive the knife deeper. When Dutch leaves John to die on the trolley tracks and later insists John abandon them, it is Micah's version of events he clings to. When Arthur discovers the money in the cave and tries to pull Dutch back from the brink, Micah frames it as another grab for control, another betrayal. Each whisper isolates Dutch further from Arthur, from John, from the memory of Hosea's measured counsel. What happens when a leader loses his conscience and replaces it with a mirror that only reflects his pride? In Beaver Hollow, the gang's soul is effectively swapped out, wisdom and restraint traded for flattery and bloodlust, a family turned into a paranoid cult around a fading prophet. And as Micah's influence tightens, one final, deadly test of loyalty is waiting in the dark of that cave. In Beaver Hollow, Dutch demands one last test of faith in the dark. But the real price of his philosophy was already written in blood years earlier on a sunny street in Rhodes and a rain-slick rooftop in Saint Denis. The cost of loyalty is not measured in speeches. It is measured in the faces that never come back to camp. Sean McGuire is the gang's future in loud, chaotic form. A brash Irish outlaw with a grin wider than the Lemoyne swamps, he is reckless, fearless, infuriating, and, in the truest sense, alive. He teases Arthur, flirts with danger, and treats every robbery as a stage. Dutch calls the gang a family, and Sean is the loud younger brother who never learned to whisper. For Dutch's idealistic story of freedom and rebellion, Sean is the living embodiment of the next generation that is supposed to inherit that dream. Lenny Summers stands at the other end of that promise. Young, sharp, and ambitious, he reads books by lantern light, talks about the world beyond the gun, and imagines a future where he is more than just another wanted poster. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's camp has always needed believers. And Lenny believes. He listens to Dutch's philosophy about civilization crushing the free man, and thinks there might be a place for someone like him in that new world Dutch keeps describing. Then Rhodes happens. The gang strolls into town, pretending to be harmless farmhands, trading banter and false peace. A wagon rolls by. A quiet moment hangs in the air, and Sean's head explodes in a single. Brutal shot, no warning, no last words. The ambush is over almost before anyone understands it has begun. That sudden silence after Sean's laughter dies? That is the sound of the camp's confidence cracking. Saint Denis finishes what Rhodes started. The grand bank heist, sold by Dutch as a decisive strike for their freedom, collapses into chaos. Hosea is executed in the square, and on the rooftops, in the storm and gun smoke, Lenny fights beside Arthur. 1 second he is there, shouting, alive. The next he is cut down by rifle fire, tumbling into the dark streets below. A young man who dreamed of a different life dies defending a plan that never had one. Dutch calls both deaths sacrifices. He tells the survivors that Sean and Lenny died for the cause, for the dream, for the family. Each funeral becomes a sermon, each grave another argument for more loyalty, more trust, more blind faith. Questioning the plan becomes betrayal, doubting Dutch becomes heresy. But around the fire, when the speeches fade, grief lingers. Arthur drinks and grows quieter, replaying those moments in Rhodes and Saint Denis, wondering when Dutch stopped protecting the young and started spending them. Tilly, Mary Beth, even hardened men like Charles and Bill feel the absence in the daily rhythm of camp. How many futures were buried with those boys? How many dreams went into the ground? With every mound of fresh dirt, the illusion of Dutch as protector erodes. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, yet Dutch refuses to change with it, clinging to his own reflection. Some are too afraid to admit what they see, others too invested in the legend to let go. But the story of the Vanderlinde Gang is already tilting toward tragedy, and the ghosts of Sean and Lenny will be standing there when the last gun is drawn. By the time the ghosts of Sean and Lenny are haunting every campfire, another shadow has already taken shape on the horizon. It has a badge, a budget, and a mandate from civilization itself. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency steps into the story of the Vanderlinde Gang as the living embodiment of a new order, determined to prove that the age of the outlaw is over. At its head in 1899 stands Agent Andrew Milton, a hard, weary professional who has hunted men for decades, and at his side a younger, sharper presence, Edgar Ross. From the very beginning, these are not dusty sheriffs chasing rumors on horseback. They are organized, well-funded, and ideologically committed. In the truest sense, they are missionaries of the state, convinced that Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John are not folk heroes but obstacles to progress that must be erased. Their first major collision comes at Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, when Milton and Ross ride straight into the gang's temporary peace. Dutch answers their ultimatum with speeches about freedom, corruption, and the right to live outside a rigged system. Milton answers with arrest warrants, dead informants, and the promise that Blackwater will not be forgiven. Dutch is playing at philosophy, Milton is playing with a stacked deck. From there, the pressure never lets up. Pinkerton gunboats haunt the bayous near Shady Belle, and agents stalk the streets of Saint Denis, armed not only with rifles but with telegraphs, rail schedules, and political backing from men in Washington. Each raid, each interrogation, each tense negotiation strips away another layer of the gang's illusion that this is still a story of clever bandits outwitting slow lawmen. How can a camp in the trees compete with a file in a government office? Information becomes the real weapon. Milton squeezes captured O'Driscolls, flips minor crooks, and quietly turns Micah Bell into an informant, boxing the gang in without them even realizing the walls are closing. Every move to a new hideout, from its humble beginnings in Coulter to the rot of Beaver Hollow, is already anticipated. The world was changing, and every telegraph wire strung across the plains tightens around Dutch's neck. The irony is brutal. Dutch insists on the old ways, grand speeches, big scores, dramatic last stands. But the Saint Denis bank robbery, his ultimate gesture of defiance, is exactly the kind of predictable spectacle Milton can prepare for. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's refusal to adapt turns his dreams into delusions, his code into a map the Pinkertons can read. Through it all, Edgar Ross watches and learns. He is quieter than Milton, less theatrical, but he studies Dutch, Arthur, and especially John Marston. When Milton falls at Beaver Hollow, Ross survives, carrying the lessons of this manhunt into a new century. The fall of the Vanderlinde Gang becomes the blueprint for a colder era, one where the state no longer chases legends but dismantles families, one man at a time. The frontier ends with Dutch's last stand, but Ross's story is only beginning, and somewhere down the line, John's brief peace on a ranch will be measured against a Pinkerton file with his name on it. Ross's new era of methodical manhunting has a blueprint, but that blueprint was written in blood long before John ever stepped onto Beecher's Hope. The collapse of the Vanderlinde Gang is, in the truest sense, a story of betrayal from within, where the real informant stands close enough to Dutch to whisper in his ear, while everyone else bleeds for his philosophy. From the very beginning of the 1899 campaign, something is wrong. The Pinkertons are always a step too close, their timing always a little too perfect. Blackwater is a disaster, Coulter is barely a refuge, and by the time the gang reaches Horseshoe Overlook, Agent Milton already knows names, habits, even Dutch's rhetoric about freedom and civilization. How? The world was changing, but the agency's uncanny precision hints at more than just good detective work. Enter Micah Bell, a late arrival, a man with no shared history from its humble beginnings. Yet somehow he rises faster in Dutch's esteem than Arthur, John, or Hosea ever did. After the failed Saint Denis bank job, Milton spells it out during that tense meeting in the alley. The Pinkertons have someone on the inside. Later, when Milton corners Arthur at the trolley station and again at Annisburg, he makes the implication even sharper, offering Dutch immunity and a future in exchange for cooperation. Micah is the living embodiment of that offer, an outlaw who sees betrayal not as a sin, but as leverage. Dutch's growing paranoia turns this hidden deal into a weapon. Faced with mounting pressure and grief, he begins to see treachery everywhere except where it actually stands. Arthur questions him? That is doubt. John wants to leave for his family? That is disloyalty. Longtime loyalists become suspects, while Micah, the newest and shadiest voice in the camp, becomes the one man Dutch insists on trusting. By Beaver Hollow, accusations themselves are currency. The standoff in the cave is the moment the gang's dream of family finally tears in half. Arthur and John accuse Micah of working with the Pinkertons. Micah fires back that Arthur is the traitor, a lost soul turned against Dutch by sickness and sentiment. Dutch does not weigh evidence, he weighs flattery. Micah tells him he is still right, still brilliant, still the man from the early days. Arthur tells him the old ways were dying, and that Dutch has lost his way. Which voice could a crumbling ego bear to hear? The tragic irony is brutal. A gang built on loyalty, on shared dreams of freedom from a rigged civilization, ends up devouring itself from the inside while the real traitor stands at Dutch's shoulder, gun drawn, shouting about honor. Yet the deeper betrayal is not just Micah's. It is Dutch's betrayal of his own ideals, and the inevitable collapse of a system founded on lies, violence, and a leader who can no longer tell truth from praise. Because once a family becomes a cult of personality, what happens the moment someone finally dares to say Dutch is wrong? That answer finally comes when Arthur stops lowering his eyes and starts saying the quiet part out loud. Dutch is wrong, and has been wrong for a long time. The cult of personality meets the cough of a dying man, and the result is a reckoning that no one in Beaver Hollow can unhear. The very beginning of that open defiance comes on the mountain, when Dutch chooses to abandon John during the rescue. John is mauled, hanging off the cliff, and Dutch simply lets go, muttering about weight and sacrifice. Arthur drags John back alone, frostbitten and furious. Later, when Dutch tries to fold it into his philosophy of hard choices, Arthur finally pushes back. If this gang is family, how does a father leave a son to die for convenience? From there, the arguments escalate. In Saint Denis, Dutch blows up an entire street and shrugs off the innocents caught in the crossfire as the price of progress, echoing the very civilization he claims to hate. Arthur, who once believed this was a story of robbing the rich and corrupt, begins asking questions Dutch refuses to answer. Each time he challenges the plan, Dutch accuses him of losing faith, of being poisoned by doubt, rather than addressing the bodies piling up behind them. By Beaver Hollow, Arthur's illness turns those doubts into urgency. Every cough is a reminder that time is running out, that this lost soul does not have many chances left to pull Dutch back from the brink or at least drag John and Abigail out of the fire. When Dutch sides with Micah and leaves John behind on the train job, Arthur's restraint finally snaps. In the camp, in front of the others, he calls it what it is: betrayal, not strategy. Dutch's response is not remorse, but rage. Denial, anger, manipulation, Dutch cycles through them in seconds. He accuses Arthur of ingratitude, of forgetting who made him, of siding with the enemy. He paints Micah as the only loyal man left, the living embodiment of commitment to the cause, while longtime family are recast as traitors. It is a cruel inversion of from its humble beginnings, when loyalty meant questioning power, not worshipping it. Around them, the gang listens. Charles, Sadie, and eventually, John begin to stand closer to Arthur, their silence a quiet verdict on Dutch's delusions. Others, like Bill and Javier, cling to Dutch's authority, too afraid, too invested, or too broken to admit the old ways were dying along with the dream. Some look at Arthur's pale face and hear a dead man talking. Others hear the only honest voice left. In the truest sense, these confrontations are the tragic culmination of their relationship, the student who believed too much, and the teacher who can no longer live up to his own lessons. Dutch once taught Arthur to question the world, to resist the cages of civilization. Now Arthur turns that same scrutiny on Dutch himself. What happens when the philosophy outgrows the preacher? The answer will decide who walks away from Beaver Hollow and who becomes another ghost in Dutch's long, bloody story. Dutch's voice is fading from Arthur's mind by this point, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous to the gang's old order: clarity. The philosophy that once promised freedom now feels hollow. The speeches about civilization in cages exposed as a story of one man's ego. In Beaver Hollow, Arthur finally understands that the gang as an idea is already dead. But John, Abigail, and Jack? They still have a chance. That realization does not arrive in a single thunderclap. It builds through small moments, through the way Dutch abandons John in the Saint Denis bank heist, through his cold dismissal when John is rotting in Sisika Penitentiary. When Arthur rides with Sadi to break John out, he is not just defying Dutch's orders, he is choosing a new kind of loyalty. Saving John means directly opposing the man who raised him. It means admitting that the very beginning of his outlaw life now demands a different ending. From that prison break forward, Arthur becomes the living embodiment of a dying ideal repurposed for a single purpose: get John's family out. He helps John secure money, first by pushing him toward honest work, then by dragging him through one last robbery at the army payroll train, knowing every bullet and cough is a reminder that time is running out. He helps steal horses, scouts routes out of the valley, and quietly urges Abigail to be ready to run. Each act is a betrayal of Dutch's plan, and yet in the truest sense, it is the first time Arthur's loyalty feels clean. Their conversations in these final missions carry the weight of years. On the ride back from Sisika, Arthur confronts John about abandoning Abigail and Jack, about chasing the same dreams and delusions that kept the gang chained to Dutch. Later, as they plan their escape, Arthur admits his own failures, confessing that he followed Dutch blindly, hurt people who did not deserve it, and mistook Dutch's words for wisdom. He tells John to be better, to build a real family, not a campfire myth. How often does an outlaw get to pass on a legacy that is not measured in bodies? Arthur's body becomes the clock ticking over all of this. The tuberculosis that once seemed a distant sentence now dominates every frame. The blood on his hand after a coughing fit, the way he struggles into the saddle, the pauses where he has to catch his breath while insisting he is fine. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur can feel both in his lungs. Yet he rides harder, pushes further, determined to carve out a future he knows he will never see. By the time he sends John up that final ridge toward safety, Arthur's shift is complete. His faith is no longer in Dutch's dream of resistance, but in John's simple reality: a ranch, a wife, a boy who grows up knowing his father tried. From its humble beginnings as an idealistic crusade to this quiet act of self-erasure, the Vanderlinde saga reaches its true moral climax here. An aging outlaw, a lost soul from another era, chooses to save what can be saved. The question that remains is how long John can carry that burden before the past comes calling again. John rides toward a fragile future, but Arthur's story of sacrifice is forged in a place where the air is thin and the world is closing in. Before a ranch and a family can exist, a dying outlaw has to climb a mountain and bury the dream that raised him. The last ride begins in the dark. Arthur, already marked by tuberculosis and betrayal, turns his horse toward the cliffs above Beaver Hollow as the Pinkertons close in. The gang is scattering, Dutch's grand philosophy has collapsed into paranoia, and the man who once preached freedom now hides in caves. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur knows there is only one thing left to do: stop Micah Bell. That ascent is brutal. Arthur staggers through trees and rocks, exchanging gunfire with Pinkertons and former comrades who still cling to Dutch's promises. Each step costs him breath he does not have. Each trigger pull feels heavier. In the truest sense, the mountain becomes a trial by fire, a final test of loyalty where the cost is not gold or glory, but the last minutes of his life. At the summit, the story tightens to its cruelest point. Micah and Arthur brawl in the dust and blood, two visions of the gang tearing each other apart. Micah fights for greed, for survival at any cost. Arthur fights for John, for the remnants of a family that once meant something. When Dutch appears, gun drawn, the scene becomes the living embodiment of the gang's collapse: the mentor, the prodigal son, and the snake he led into the garden. Arthur does not beg. He does not flatter Dutch's ego. He lays the betrayal bare, telling Dutch what the audience already knows. Micah has been feeding information to the Pinkertons since the very beginning. All the raids gone wrong, all the ambushes, all the deaths that felt cursed by bad luck were in fact sabotage. Dutch's dream was not just doomed by civilization, it was rotting from within. Dutch's reaction is not righteous fury. It is silence, hesitation, a gun that never quite decides where to point. In that awful pause, Dutch is exposed as a man who has lost the ability to choose between his ideals and his appetites. When he finally turns and walks away from both Arthur and Micah, leaving them on the mountain, it is moral paralysis made flesh. He abandons the oldest son who believed, and the new favorite who enabled his delusions. Arthur's last moments shift with his choices, but the meaning holds. If he helps John escape instead of chasing the money, he dies watching the sunrise, coughing blood as the light spreads over a world he knows he cannot follow. It is peaceful, but not easy. a hard-won grace for a man who spent years as Dutch's enforcer. If he clings to the money, he dies in the dirt, beaten and stabbed, staring up at storm clouds as Micah walks away. Either way, the gang's conscience ends on that mountain. With Arthur gone, Dutch and Micah stagger on, dragging a twisted, hollow version of the dream behind them. The speeches remain, the talk of freedom and family still echoes, but the last true believer is dead. What happens when a philosophy survives without its heart? The answer will echo for years, and another Marston will be the one forced to hear it. Arthur's death on the mountain is not the end of the Vanderlinde Gang story. It is the moment the soul leaves the body. The corpse keeps moving a little longer. That final stagger carries Dutch, Micah, and the remnants into Beaver Hollow, where the dream finally burns. Beaver Hollow is the living embodiment of what the gang has become. From its humble beginnings in open, sunlit camps, the story has sunk into a damp, choking cave system, hidden in the woods and rotting from within. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's answer was to burrow underground, dragging his family into a hole that feels less like a hideout and more like a grave prepared in advance. When the Pinkertons come, they do not creep, they descend. Lanterns flare in the trees, dogs bark, and the shout of Vanderlinde echoes through the night as gunfire slams into the rock. The last camp becomes a killing ground in seconds. Bullets spark off stalactites, smoke fills the tunnels, and the gang's final refuge turns, in the truest sense, into a tomb. This is not a noble last stand. It is a raid on a collapsing delusion. In the chaos, loyalties shatter faster than the lantern glass. Javier and Bill peel away, driven more by survival than by belief. Some lesser-known outlaws, men and women who once laughed around the fire, are cut down in the dark and vanish from the record, their absence in later years explained by a single brutal night. Others, like Pearson and Tilly, had already slipped away, choosing the uncertain mercy of civilization over the certainty of Dutch's madness. Who can blame them? Inside the caves, a few still try to defend the dream. They fire back, drag the wounded, curse the Pinkertons and the world that pushed them here. But even as they fight, the philosophy they claim to protect is already dead. Dutch rants about freedom and betrayal, yet listens only to Micah, whose whispers have replaced Hosea's counsel. The man who once preached loyalty above all now watches his family fall, and measures only his own escape. Key fates are sealed in the confusion. Unnamed gunmen who rode from Rhodes, from St. Denis, from the Grizzlies, simply do not emerge. Their missing futures in Red Dead Redemption are written here, in bodies left in the mud or dragged off in chains. A few follow Dutch and Micah as they slip out through the back, vanishing into the wilderness as nameless accomplices to a broken prophet. Dutch does not die with his gang. He abandons it. No last stand, no final charge. Only a quiet retreat into the trees while others buy his exit with blood. That is the moment the mask finally cracks. The man who promised family chooses self-preservation, and the gang ceases to exist as anything but a story of what once was. Beaver Hollow does not end with a triumphant blaze of glory. It ends with smoke, silence, and absence. From here on, the Vanderlinde Gang lives only in rumors, in wanted posters, and in the memories of those who survived long enough to regret it. And one of those survivors, a former outlaw named John Marston, is about to learn that the world is not finished with that story yet. The story does not end at Beaver Hollow. It lingers, 8 years later, in a different winter, on a different mountain, where the ghosts of the Vanderlinde Gang finally step out of rumor and back into the cold light. The world was changing. John Marston was changing. But the past was not done with him. By 1907, John has done what once seemed impossible for a man raised by Dutch. He has tried to become a rancher, a husband, a father, a small piece of civilization instead of its enemy. Yet the old ways were dying slowly, and some debts refused to stay buried. When Sadie Adler brings word of Micah Bell's whereabouts, hiding out in a fortified cabin in the Grizzlies, John saddles up. This is not just another bounty. It is the last unresolved chapter of a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family turned enemy. The climb to Micah's hideout feels like a grim echo of Coulter from the very beginning, snow whipping across the screen, horses struggling through drifts, and outlaws' sins circling back through the same frozen mountains. Micah has gathered his own ragged crew, a cruel parody of Dutch's old gang, and the approach turns into a brutal, close-quarters siege. Then, on the balcony, amid shattered wood and swirling snow, the past quite literally steps out of the shadows. Dutch Vanderlinde is there, older, thinner, dressed in dark, expensive clothes that do not quite hide the hollowness in his eyes. For a moment, time folds in on itself. John faces the man who betrayed him by believing Micah, and the man who betrayed everyone by doing nothing as the gang tore itself apart. Micah rants, John seethes, Sadie bleeds in the snow. Dutch stands between them, the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy gone to rot. Who does he stand with now? The standoff is almost unbearable because no speech can fix what has been broken. Dutch listens to Micah snarl about the money, to John demand justice, to the wind howling over the ridge. Then he does something no one expects. He shoots Micah in the chest, without a speech, without justification, without even looking John in the eye for long. In the truest sense, it is a confession made in action rather than words. Dutch steps aside, lets John finish Micah, then walks into the cabin and stares at the Blackwater money that once meant salvation. He leaves it behind. Is it guilt for Arthur, exhaustion with the outlaw dream, or a final, ambiguous attempt at redemption? The game never answers. It simply shows a broken man walking away from the fortune that destroyed his family. From its humble beginnings, with Dutch and Hosea robbing the rich and corrupt, the Vanderlinde Gang ends here. In a silent nod, a corpse in the snow, and a leader too tired to claim the prize. Yet this is not Dutch's true end. Red Dead Redemption reveals that he cannot abandon the fantasy. Years later, he builds a smaller gang in the mountains, preaching the same philosophy of freedom against civilization, now twisted into pure delusion. When John finally corners Dutch at Cochonay, the circle that began with a boy adopted from the streets and a lost soul given a cause closes for good. Dutch refuses capture, tells John that the world they fought against has won, and throws himself from the cliff. He chooses death over a cage, unable to live in the world he helped create, unable to admit that his revolution ended with him running from two former sons. That is why the snowy epilogue in 1907 matters so much. It is the last echo of the Vanderlinde saga, the final time Dutch shares a frame with one of his old family. Micah's death is justice, but Dutch's quiet retreat is something stranger. Not absolution, not quite punishment, but a man trapped between myth and reality, walking out of the story he once controlled. The gang that began as an idealistic rebellion dies in pieces, at Beaver Hollow, on Mount Hagen, and finally at Cochonay, scattered across a West that no longer has room for outlaws pretending to be prophets. And John, standing in that snow with the money at his feet, becomes the bridge to the next chapter of this world, a man who has seen the cost of Dutch's dreams, and will soon be forced to pay his own. John walks off that mountain carrying more than a satchel of money. He carries the death certificate of Dutch's dream, and the debt that will follow him into the next decade. Red Dead Redemption is not a new story. It is the echo of the old one, the living embodiment of how the past refuses to stay buried. By 1911, the Pinkertons' war on the Vanderlinde Gang has changed uniforms, but not methods. What began with Milton and Ross hounding Dutch through the heartlands becomes Edgar Ross standing on a train platform in Blackwater, holding Abigail and Jack hostage, and informing John that his freedom now has a price. Hunt down Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and Dutch himself, or lose the only family he has left. The government did not forget Dutch's students. It simply found a new way to weaponize them. John's reluctant work as a government gunman is a story of loyalty twisted into leverage. Once, he rode with Bill at Fort Mercer, shared campfires with Javier, and followed Dutch into ambushes in places just like Cochonay. Now he storms Fort Mercer under a government flag, chases Escuela through the hills of Nuevo Parazo, and climbs another snow-covered mountain to face Dutch one final time. Every target on Ross's list is a ghost from Horseshoe Overlook and Beaver Hollow, and every pull of the trigger is John killing a version of himself. Those memories shape the man he tries to become. When John talks about his past to Bonnie McFarlane, there is no romantic outlaw mythology. Only a tired admission that the world was changing and the old ways were dying. Around Uncle and Abigail at Beecher's Hope, his irritation with Uncle's laziness and Jack's fascination with dime novels comes from experience. He knows where Dutch's philosophy leads. Teaching Jack to herd cattle instead of rob trains is his attempt to rewrite the ending Arthur begged him to choose. The land itself remembers. The burned-out settlement of Tumbleweed, the decaying mansions of West Elizabeth, the Blackwater shoreline still whispered about by lawmen and ferrymen, all feel like crime scenes from an earlier chapter. Passing through Thieves' Landing, or hearing townsfolk gossip about Dutch's last stand at Cochenay, the player moves through a world haunted by conversations once held around a campfire, by names that no longer appear on wanted posters but still linger in local legend. In the truest sense, New Austin is an unmarked graveyard for the gang. At the center of this new order stands Edgar Ross, the bureaucratic heir to Milton. Milton tried to break Dutch with bullets and brute force. Ross breaks John with contracts and conditional pardons. He praises John as a patriot while treating him as expendable property, a tool to be discarded once the job is done. When Ross rides away from Beecher's Hope after the final ambush, leaving Jack an orphan, it completes the circle that began when Milton cornered the gang in Ballantyne. The state uses outlaws to kill outlaws, then kills the last outlaw when he starts dreaming of peace. Red Dead Redemption becomes the epilogue to the Vanderlinde saga, the last surviving student of Dutch's philosophy trying to live a quiet life in a world that only recognizes him through the barrel of a gun. John builds fences where he once broke locks, brands cattle where he once burned stagecoaches, and teaches Jack letters instead of how to draw a revolver. Yet the same civilization that demanded his transformation cannot allow him to fully escape who he was. The question hanging over Beecher's Hope is simple and merciless. Can a man raised on Dutch's promises ever truly outrun Dutch's shadow? Or is someone already riding toward that little ranch to prove otherwise? Civilization remembers differently. Where Beecher's Hope holds one man trying to bury his past under fence posts and corn, the wider world turns that same past into headlines, rumors, and half-remembered legends. In the newspapers that circulate through St. Denis, Blackwater, and beyond, the Vanderlinde Gang is not a broken family in hiding. It is a brand. A story of blood, bounty, and spectacle that can be sold for a nickel. From the very beginning, the in-game papers reduce years of wandering, dreaming, and failing into simple binaries, notorious outlaws versus brave lawmen. After Blackwater, lurid articles hint at a ferry massacre no one quite understands, exaggerating body counts and motives. Later, St. Denis columns sneer at bandits masquerading as philosophers, mocking Dutch's rhetoric while still using his name to sell copies. The world was changing, and even in this rough frontier, crime becomes content. The gang's philosophy flattened into a cautionary tale about what happens when men refuse to bow to civilization. Wanted posters do the rest. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, John, Javier, Bill, Micah, faces nailed to telegraph poles and saloon walls, each reduced to a bounty figure and a single word, dead. Those sheets do not mention Hosea's quiet grief for Bessie, or Arthur teaching Jack to fish, or Charles feeding the camp when no one else can. They erase loyalty and doubt, leaving only price tags on human lives. To the passerby, the gang is not a community. It is a shopping list for bounty hunters. Out on the trails, strangers fill in the gaps with their own versions. A ranch hand in New Austin mutters that Dutch was a madman who slaughtered innocents for fun. A drunk in a Valentine saloon swears Arthur Morgan robbed him single-handed, riding through town like the living embodiment of the devil himself. Yet others, especially those helped in side roads and forgotten missions, whisper about a different image, outlaws who gave money to the poor, who defended women, who stood up to the rich. Monsters to some, folk heroes to others. How long does it take for truth to become myth? Then there are the places the gang leaves behind. Old fire pits in the Grizzlies, a broken wagon at Horseshoe Overlook, the rotting boards of Shady Bell, the choking darkness of Beaver Hollow. Long after the guns fall silent, these abandoned campsites linger as quiet memorials, from its humble beginnings as a roaming family to its paranoid end in the mud. Graves scattered across the map, Arthur on his lonely hill, Hosea and Lenny overlooking the bayou, Susan by the ruined hideout, speak more honestly than any headline. Amid all this noise, one fragile artifact resists simplification, Arthur's journal. In the truest sense, it is a countermyth, a handwritten record of doubts, sketches, and fleeting moments of kindness. He questions Dutch's decisions, worries over John, mourns the dead, and wonders if their dreams of freedom were ever real or only delusions dressed up as philosophy. The journal remembers the jokes, the campfire songs, the way the world felt as the old ways were dying. And that is the tragedy. The messy human story traced across these years of family, betrayal, and lost soul after lost soul will mostly survive as headlines, rumors, and wanted posters. The legend remembers the shootouts and the body counts. The world forgets the small mercies along the way. But beneath those headlines and rumors, the question lingers: what did this gang really stand for? Beneath the gunsmoke and the wanted posters? Was it ever more than a band of thieves? Or was there, from its humble beginnings, a genuine philosophy trying to fight its way through the blood? From the very beginning, Dutch did not speak in the language of petty crime. He talked about freedom, about equality, about resisting a civilization run by railroads, bankers, and politicians who bought laws the way others bought horses. To the drifters and broken people he gathered, he promised not just money, but meaning, a family, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of men and women who would not bow to a rigged world. In the early days, there was real beauty in that dream. Robberies focused on rich and corrupt targets. Dutch and Hosea tried to avoid unnecessary killing. Campfires were filled with debates about government, progress, and what civilization really meant. In the truest sense, the gang saw itself as the living embodiment of a different America, one where the poor fought back and the outcast could belong. Yet the record of their actions tells another tale. Over time, those ideals curdled into excuses. The gang robbed trains full of ordinary workers, extorted struggling ranchers, and left towns in ruins. Innocents died in Rhodes, in Valentine, in St. Denis. Blackwater's Ferry was not a noble strike against tyranny. It was a disaster born of greed and overconfidence. The gang that spoke of the downtrodden ended up exploiting the very people it claimed to defend. At the center of that collapse stood Dutch. Faced with failure, he chose ego over responsibility, pride over repentance. Each betrayal, of Arthur, of John, of the families who trusted him, pushed him further into delusion. Was he still a revolutionary, or just an outlaw dressing selfishness in grand speeches? By Beaver Hollow, his philosophy had become a mask he wore to avoid seeing what he had done. In this way, the Vanderlinde Gang becomes a mirror for the Old West itself, romanticized and violent, fiercely independent and deeply cruel. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying under the weight of railroads, factories, telegram wires, and federal agents. Dutch's campfire speeches could not compete with the cold efficiency of centralized power, and his dream was no more compatible with the new America than wild bison were with barbed wire. Yet within that doomed system, individual choices still mattered. Arthur's late transformation, from enforcer to conscience, from loyal soldier to man willing to die for John's future, shows that a lost soul can still find a different path. John's struggle on Beecher's Hope continues that thread, an echo of Dutch's better ideals stripped of his vanity. Together, they hint that the gang's only real redemption lies not in Dutch's grand design, but in the quiet, painful decision to break from it. So did Dutch ever truly believe his own words? Or were belief and self-deception always fused in him, as they often are in men who try to bend history to their will? That tension between sincerity and delusion, between freedom and civilization, is what gives the gang's story its enduring power, and it is what will haunt the final years of those who survived Dutch's dream. Across these 200 hidden threads, a different Vanderlinde Gang emerges, stranger and sadder than the legend, yet in the truest sense more complete. What once seemed a simple tale of outlaws on the run becomes a story of fragile ideals, buried compromises, and quiet choices made long before the first shot in Blackwater. From the very beginning, obscure dialogue and half-heard camp conversations have been filling in the blank spaces. Dutch and Hosea's early years, glimpsed in old robbery tales and that fleeting memory of them trying to rob each other on the same train, reveal not just partners in crime, but architects of a philosophy. Letters in cabins, faded wanted posters, and lawmen muttering about an unseen ferry job turned the Blackwater disaster from a single botched robbery into the culmination of decades of risk, arrogance, and belief that the world would always bend to Dutch's will. Side missions and stranger encounters make Micah's betrayal feel inevitable rather than sudden. comments about him joining only months before Blackwater, the way he needles Bill, flatters Dutch, and quietly isolates Arthur, show a man testing the gang's weak points. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is hidden in those throwaway lines, waiting to be pieced together. Through all of this, the emotional arcs sharpen. Arthur's journey from believer to protector is no longer just about a man who changes his mind. It is about a boy taken in from his humble beginnings as a street thief, shaped by Dutch's words and Hosea's pragmatism, slowly realizing that the family he would die for must be saved from its own father. John's path, from reluctant disciple who keeps running away to haunted survivor, is traced in every argument over responsibility, every missed return to camp, every scar he carries into the next game. Dutch's fall, from idealistic outlaw philosopher to hollow legend, becomes the living embodiment of a dying frontier. Each camp move, from open horseshoe overlook to the swamp rot of Shady Bell and the suffocating darkness of Beaver Hollow, mirrors his shrinking world. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and he could not accept it, so he turned on anyone who reminded him of that truth. Camp life and minor characters, once background noise, now explain why the gang held together so long and why it finally shattered. Susan's discipline, Pearson's meals, Tilly's stories, Mary Beth's novels, even the children playing in the mud, create a fragile civilization in the wilderness. How hard is it to walk away from warmth, from music, from people who know every failure and forgive it? Yet those same bonds become chains when the philosophy at the center collapses. Seen against Red Dead Redemption, every hidden detail recontextualizes John's later choices, his reluctance to hunt Dutch, his complicated mercy toward Javier, his bitterness toward Bill. All make sense when the full saga is known. The world's response to John, treating him as a relic to be used and discarded, echoes how the gang itself was used by Dutch's crumbling dream. Taken together, these 200 facts reconstruct not just events, but an entire inner history. In many ways, the Vanderlinde Gang never knew its own story as clearly as it stands now. The next step is to follow that knowledge into the endgame, and to watch how every hidden thread tightens around those who survived Dutch's promise of freedom. All those hidden threads now lead back to the same place. A dying fire, a half-empty bottle, and a circle of outlaws who never truly understood the story they were living through. The gang is gone. The camps are abandoned. But the legend still sits down at the flames and waits for another voice to speak. So the circle opens. Among the Vanderlinde, which soul feels closest in spirit? Arthur, the weary conscience who tried to drag an outlaw family towards some last scrap of honor? John, standing between past and future, torn between freedom and civilization? Hosea, the tired magician who saw the trick behind Dutch's philosophy long before the bullets started flying? Or perhaps the connection lies with a quieter presence. Charles, the living embodiment of loyalty without delusion. Sadie, who turned grief into ruthless purpose. Javier or Bill, clinging to Dutch's dream long after it had curdled. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s to the final charge at Beaver Hollow, every member carried secrets. One question now lingers: which Vanderlinde member speaks loudest through those secrets, and why? Let the answer come with one obscure detail about them, one small shard of lore that has not yet been named. A half-remembered campfire conversation from Horseshoe Overlook, a stray newspaper clipping about Blackwater, a throwaway stranger encounter that suddenly reframes an entire philosophy of freedom and betrayal. Because even after 200 facts, the deepest questions remain open. Who, from the very beginning, understood that the gang was doomed? Was it Hosea, quietly watching the world change around a leader who refused to bend? Was it Arthur, coughing blood in the mud as the old ways were dying around him? Or was it someone on the margins, a lost soul in the background who saw more clearly than Dutch ever did? Did Dutch truly believe his own ideals? Or did belief slowly rot into performance until only pride was left? At what precise moment was the gang's fate sealed? Blackwater, Saint Denis, Guarma, or the instant Micah rode into camp and Dutch chose him over everyone else? The next chapter of this story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, will follow single riders, instead of the whole caravan. Entire deep dives wait for Hosea's complete history, for Micah's long trail of bodies, for Javier and Bill beyond the gang's collapse, and for the women of the camp whose quiet labor held that fragile family together. The sharpest, strangest, most convincing fragments of lore will shape those journeys, turning scattered theories into full portraits. For those drawn to slow, narrative-driven explorations of this world, there is still far more to uncover. Side missions, background dialogue, even the layout of each camp still hide perspectives on freedom, family, and civilization that have not yet been brought to the fire. In the truest sense, the Vanderlinde Gang is finished. Yet as long as this tale is retold, as long as new voices gather around that imaginary campfire and argue over Dutch's dream, the legend rides on into the dark. The fire is low, but it is not out. The circle is open. Add another story to the flames.